In the early morning hours of September 21st, 2009, a man woke up in his bed and he could hear there was this strange metal clinking sound coming from the dark corner of his bedroom. The man's heart began to race as he turned and looked in the direction of the sound. And when he saw what was there, he gasped because there was someone standing in the corner staring right at him. And then the figure began moving toward the man, and with each step, that clinking sound got louder. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please take pictures of the Like Button's brand new car and list it online for sale. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the early afternoon on April 13th, 1985, 60-year-old Dorothy Thompson walked into a bank in St. Bernard, Louisiana. Her hip was really bothering her, so she was moving slowly, but at the same time, she was also trying extra hard not to limp or seem unsteady. She knew the people in her small town liked to gossip about her, and so she didn't want to give them anything new to talk about. But, as expected, despite her best efforts to conceal her slower, sort of limpy movement, when she got into the lobby, the handful of tellers and customers that were inside looked towards her, took stock of her, and began whispering. So the little town of St. Bernard was about 5 miles outside of New Orleans, and it was the kind of place where people were generally pretty friendly and everyone seemed to know everyone. But this smallness made it pretty easy for rumors to spread. And most of those rumors in this town seemed to be about Dorothy. Dorothy did have to admit, though, that she had given people a lot to talk about. Dorothy, who had lived in this town for 39 years, was the owner of the town's pet cemetery. Now, this pet cemetery was actually a true business. Dorothy made her income from pet owners, buying plots of land in the cemetery. But that wasn't really the thing that made, Dorothy stand out as the centerpiece of gossip. It was the fact that she not only owned this pet cemetery, but she lived on the cemetery by herself. And considering the fact that the cemetery also had a rumor of being haunted, it just seemed like, how could anybody do that? How could she live there full time? And these ghost stories, surrounding this pet cemetery were not just, to do with animals that had been buried there, but they were about people. Because people had died on this property, including both of Dorothy's husbands. The first husband was a very heavy drinker who regularly abused Dorothy. And it got so bad at a certain point that she eventually just shot him in self-defense and killed him. So that's how he died. And then her second husband had died from suicide. And Dorothy was the one who actually found his body on the porch. And so these deaths had led to more stories about Dorothy and how she was some kind of husband killer. But what people didn't see was how much all this death really weighed on her. And when her mother died about 6 years ago, it had almost broken Dorothy completely. Dorothy and her mother were incredibly close, and after she died, Dorothy got so depressed that she had to be admitted to the hospital for quite a while. She was doing better now, but some days were still really hard. And so now, at the bank, Dorothy ignored the look she got as she approached the teller. She needed to get cash out to pay her handyman, Kenny Pommier, who had done some work at the cemetery that morning. And because Dorothy didn't actually drive, Kenny was also her chauffeur for the day. And he was outside right now, waiting to take her on a few more errands. So Dorothy told the teller how much money she needed, and then after they counted it out and handed it to her, Dorothy took the cash, turned around, and headed back outside. A couple hours later, around 4 p.m., Dorothy sat in the passenger seat of Kenny's car as he drove down a highway. They had just wrapped up at the grocery store, and now he was taking her back home. As they drove, the two made some small talk, mostly about the weather and also the work that Kenny had done that morning on the grounds. But the truth was, Dorothy didn't really know Kenny at all. I mean, she had just hired him the day before. But he seemed nice enough, and she was hoping he would stick around for a while. After all, she had had a pretty high turnover rate amongst her handymen over the last year, and so she was hoping now for some consistency. So both the pet cemetery itself and Dorothy's house, which again was on the cemetery grounds, required a lot of upkeep that Dorothy was just not physically capable of doing. Besides her bad hip, she also took medication for her depression that made her weak and sometimes very disoriented. Now, sometimes Dorothy would ask her neighbors for help, but generally speaking, she preferred to just hire people to do the work because, people needed steady work, she could give that to them, and she appreciated the help. However, the problem with hiring these handymen was that unfortunately, a few of her, former handymen had turned out to be criminals. Last fall, her handyman at the time, this guy named Elkin Childress, had lived with her and worked on the grounds, but Elkin was always just sort of wandering around and exploring the property instead of taking care of it. Then she had found out he'd been arrested for robbery, so she guessed that what he was really doing when he was walking around was casing the place, looking for ways to break in or to steal something. Luckily for her, he actually quit before she had to fire him. And the guy before Elkin was even worse. His name was Brandon Nodier. Brandon was a total loudmouth who had started working for Dorothy right after her mother had died. He and his wife Bonnie had moved in with Dorothy, so Brandon could keep up with the repairs while Bonnie drove Dorothy around. But, just like Elkin, the issue she ran into with the Nodiers was theft. The previous spring, Dorothy had had this really intense depressive episode and was taking a lot of medication for it. And while she was all, medicated and groggy, the Nodiers convinced her to sell them her land for basically nothing. But when Dorothy realized what had happened, she made the Nodiers move out and then got a lawyer to overturn the deal that she had signed. And so since last year, Dorothy, along with the Nodiers, had been in this horrible legal fight over this land. And she knew, the Nodiers, Brandon and Bonnie, were furious at her. And on top of that, Brandon, who was this huge loudmouth, just would not stop talking about this dispute. Not only was he talking about it in public, but he also kept contacting Dorothy to sort of talk her into dropping the suit altogether. But Dorothy was not about to drop this issue. I mean, this cemetery and the land had belonged to her mother, and now it was hers, like it mattered to her. She's not just gonna give it up. And so now, sitting in the passenger seat of the car, Dorothy watched as Kenny turned off the highway and eventually pulled into her driveway, which was quite long and wound through some thick woods, because remember, she lives on the cemetery. It's sort of secluded from society. And as the pair drove along this driveway and got closer and closer to her home, eventually she could finally see some of the tombstones up ahead. This cemetery was enormous, and basically any kind of animal you could imagine was buried here. Some of the graves were just engraved stone slabs, but others were pretty extravagant, including one human-sized Buddhist statue of somebody's pet cat. Kenny finally pulled up in front of the house and got out to help Dorothy carry in the groceries. And when he was done, Dorothy handed over the cash that she owed him and said she would call him when she had more work. And she watched as Kenny got back in his car and drove off back down the driveway. Around 9 p.m. that night, Dorothy poured herself a healthy glass of wine and went to her bedroom to turn on the TV. She'd spent the evening going through some bills and taking calls from cemetery clients, so by now she was exhausted. But as soon as she got into bed, she heard a phone ring on the other side of the house. Dorothy groaned and took her wine with her as she shuffled down the hallway to the kitchen to answer the call. And when she answered it, she heard her friend's voice, a woman named Patricia Newman. So Patricia was about half Dorothy's age, and the two of them had been introduced by a mutual friend 3 years earlier. Patricia had started out as more of a caretaker for Dorothy, since Patricia had experience working with the elderly. But they'd gotten along really well and became quite close, to the point where they had sort of a mother-daughter type of relationship. And since Patricia only lived about 10 minutes away, Dorothy did depend on her pretty much daily for things like supervising her medication and driving her to appointments. In many ways, Patricia was like the one person outside of the hired help that she did spend a lot of time with. And so that's actually why Patricia was calling now. She wanted to know if Dorothy still needed a ride to the pharmacy the following day. And Dorothy said that she did and said thank you. And then the two talked for a bit longer before ultimately saying goodnight. After that, Dorothy hung up the phone and then poured herself a bit more wine. And then she just kind of stood in the kitchen for a bit, listening to the crickets outside. And then, when she was about to finally leave and go back to bed, she heard something. It was the sound of a car making their way slowly up her long driveway. The following morning, a little after 1 p.m., the friend, Patricia Newman, pulled up outside of Dorothy's house and threw her car into park. Patricia had called Dorothy around 9 a.m. that morning to tell her she was going to be late getting her, but Dorothy hadn't answered. Patricia had tried calling a few more times, but Dorothy never answered, which ultimately made Patricia pretty nervous. Dorothy was a heavy drinker in her 60s and was on a lot of medication. So deep down, Patricia knew it was possible Dorothy wasn't answering because she had had some kind of accident or medical emergency. So she was at Dorothy's now, not so much to take her on her errands for the day, but just to make sure she was okay. Patricia got out of her car and hurried up to Dorothy's front door. But when she knocked, there was no answer. And after looking in a few windows, she didn't see Dorothy or any kind of movement inside. It just seemed very quiet and still. Patricia went back to the front door and tried it, but she found it was locked. So she just kept on knocking for a while. And after a few more minutes of Dorothy not answering and not hearing or seeing any sign of life in there, Patricia felt worried enough that she left the front door and went to go call the police. Not long after that, Patricia was back at Dorothy's house, this time watching anxiously as 2 police officers forced Dorothy's back door open. The officers had gotten there just a few minutes ago, and Patricia had explained to them how Dorothy, could be inside and very likely was hurt or something was wrong here. And so the officers kind of fanned out and began searching around the house looking for a way in, and they found the back door was not locked, it was just jammed. So now they were in the process of getting it unjammed. And so finally, after a few swift kicks to this door, it finally gave way and it swung open, and the 2 officers, along with Patricia, went inside. Patricia immediately began yelling out Dorothy's name and going room to room looking for her, and what she quickly realized is she could hear the sound of a television that was on, and it was coming from Dorothy's bedroom. But when she went to the bedroom and looked inside, Dorothy wasn't in there. In fact, after searching the whole house, there was no sign of Dorothy anywhere. And there wasn't any sign of any kind of problem in the house, like there was no disturbance anywhere, no struggle, no accident where somebody fell over. It was just like Dorothy was gone, and that was it. Now, for the 2 officers, they didn't really know what to make of this, because to them, it didn't appear like anything horrible had happened. There was no active emergency here. It's just that, this person has left their TV on and they're not here when they should be. And that was concerning, but not enough to warrant a big reaction from authorities. But Patricia, she knew, based on what she was seeing, that this was so uncharacteristic of Dorothy that something definitely had gone wrong here. But even though Patricia really adamantly communicated that concern to the 2 officers, they just told her that, let's wait, give it a few days, and give Dorothy another couple of calls, and if she doesn't show up in the next few days, come talk to us. And so, after the police left, despite Patricia having this sense that something's off here, she did what she was told. She went home, she continued trying Dorothy, but never got an answer. She called around town to see if anybody had seen her or heard from her. But no, nobody knew where she was. And so finally, after 4 days, Patricia put in another call to the St. Bernard Sheriff's Office. And this time, she absolutely begged them to do something, because Dorothy Thompson was still missing, and now Patricia was 100% certain that something bad had to have happened to her. At around 10:30 a.m. on the same day that Patricia has made this plea for help 4 days after Dorothy had inexplicably gone missing, Detective Brian Vallelongo drove his cruiser through Dorothy Thompson's pet cemetery along with Sergeant Terrence Strada. Both men worked for the St. Bernard Sheriff's Office, and they had been tasked to look into Dorothy's disappearance. Vallelongo hadn't even gotten to the scene yet, but he was already uneasy as he drove past the animal tombstones and grave sites. This place had always creeped him out. Finally, the officer's cruiser made their way all the way to the end of the driveway, and they reached Dorothy's home. And right away, Vallelongo could see there was a woman, maybe in her 30s, who he guessed was Patricia, who was standing by the front door. She seemed visibly anxious and impatient as she stood there waiting for Vallelongo and Strada to get out of their car. And when they did get out and walked over to her, she got straight to the point. She said the last officers had not actually done a real search of the place, just a sort of basic welfare check. And so now she needed them to do a full search of Dorothy's house and her grounds to make sure Dorothy really wasn't somewhere on this property. Vallelongo and Strada assured her that they would do that. But first, they needed her to start from the beginning and tell them about the last time she saw or spoke to Dorothy. Patricia seemed pretty irritated by this and said she'd already told the officers everything she had known, both on the phone call and then previously with those other officers who had done the welfare check. Like, can we please just get into the search? But Vallelongo insisted and said, look, I don't fully know the whole story, so please, give me some information. And so, begrudgingly, she would tell Vallelongo what she knew. Basically that she had called her friend on the 13th at night to ask if Dorothy would need a ride to the pharmacy the next day. She had said yes. And then the next day comes around and Patricia calls her friend to confirm she's going to swing by and pick her up that morning. But Dorothy doesn't answer. And so eventually Patricia goes to the house. Dorothy apparently isn't there. She knocks on the door. Dorothy doesn't come out. It just seemed off. And so Patricia calls the police. They show up. They find the back door is unlocked, but jammed. They force it open. They go inside and, nothing's disturbed. And Dorothy is just missing. And there was no rhyme or reason to it. And so now Patricia was convinced that something bad had happened to Dorothy. And she really was hoping that they could help her. Vallelongo nodded and then asked Patricia if maybe Dorothy had friends or family that she might have just gone to stay with. But Patricia immediately shook her head and said no. Dorothy was pretty much alone in the world and almost never left her house. And she didn't have a car because she didn't drive. Also, Patricia said she had already called around and nobody had seen her. Friends, family, no one. And then at this point, Patricia was very clear. She told the officers that she believed the only reason Dorothy would have left her house that day or that night before was if somebody else had forced her to. Vallelongo shot Strada a look. He didn't doubt that Patricia was worried about her friend, but they need to look around before they jump to any conclusions here. So he asked Patricia if she could show them the unlocked door, and they would begin their investigation. Moments later, Vallelongo stepped into the home through that back entrance, followed by Strada and Patricia. As he walked around the house, he saw that, like Patricia had said, it was very neat and tidy. There really was no sign of anything that had gone wrong inside the house. No sign of a struggle or a fall of some kind. It was just like the house was left exactly as is. That sort of contradicted Patricia's theory that, the only way Dorothy would have left the house was if she had been forced, suggesting some form of a struggle. But at the same time, what Patricia was saying about Dorothy is that she was kind of frail. And so Vallelongo thought, okay, maybe it's possible that she was forced and, she didn't put up any kind of a fight, and that's why we don't see any disturbance. He didn't know, but it just seemed odd that nothing had been displaced if we're talking about some form of an abduction. Also, as Vallelongo continued his walk around the house, he could see that items of value, like Dorothy's TV, were still there. So it didn't seem like this had been a robbery. But unlike the first officers who had done that initial welfare check with Patricia a few days earlier, Vallelongo did agree that something wasn't right here. Because as he continued to walk around, he kept seeing signs that Dorothy had clearly not planned to leave her home or had left in a hurry. For example, there was a half-empty glass of wine in the kitchen and the television in the bedroom was still on. And so those are things that simply would not be if somebody was planning to leave for any extended period of time. And also, based on what Patricia had told them, he could rule out a family emergency suddenly taking Dorothy out of town or any kind of last-minute trip because Patricia had called around and that stuff hadn't happened. At a certain point, Vallelongo stopped walking around the home and just asked Patricia, how was Dorothy's mental state? And Patricia clearly hesitated for a second before she admitted to Vallelongo that, Dorothy was on a whole bunch of medication, and sometimes it did make her mental state kind of foggy. And so Vallelongo naturally thought, okay, maybe it's possible that in a sort of foggy mental state, maybe for whatever reason, she wandered out of the house on her own, and then once she was outside, something happened to her, whether it was, an animal, a person, a fall, anything could have happened. He knew the back door had been unlocked during that initial police welfare check. And even though he knew the door apparently had been jammed, it clearly had not been jammed so much that it prevented them from getting inside. And so maybe that door just always got stuck, and maybe that's all that happened. She walked out the back door and when she shut it, it got jammed and that was normal. And so Vallelongo turned to his partner and sort of explained to him his theory around Dorothy maybe wandering out on her own and then something else happened once she was outside and said, hey, she's clearly not here. Let's go out there and search the grounds and see if we can find her. 15 days later, a little past 7 a.m. on May 3rd, 1985, Vallelongo stepped into Strada's office to give him an update on the case. At this point, Vallelongo thought it was extremely likely that foul play was involved here, because they had searched Dorothy's house and her property a few times at this point, and they had not found Dorothy anywhere, or any evidence to explain what had happened to her. Patricia had mentioned that Dorothy had a tattoo of a cross on her left index finger. So Vallelongo had spent the last couple of weeks calling around to local hospitals and morgues to see if any women had been brought in with that marking. Vallelongo also interviewed Dorothy's neighbors and the tellers at that bank that she had gone to shortly before she vanished, and also he had interviewed some people in town who just knew who she was. He'd also tracked down Dorothy's new handyman, Kenny Pommier, who the bank had said was with Dorothy on the day she vanished. He apparently was driving her around. But none of these people had heard from Dorothy since she vanished 20 days earlier, same as Patricia. Even though nobody knew where Dorothy was and really couldn't offer all that much information to help the investigation, it was like everybody Vallelongo spoke to had a pretty strong negative opinion of Dorothy. Like that she was this recluse and that she was kind of crazy, and people thought she had murdered her husbands and buried their bodies in the pet cemetery, and also her house and her land were haunted. But, none of these rumors were going to do anything to advance the case. But it was interesting to Vallelongo that people felt this way about her. The only real lead that Vallelongo got was something he got from speaking to Dorothy's lawyer a few days ago, who had mentioned that Dorothy was in the middle of this very contentious lawsuit over the rights to her property with a pair of former employees named Bonnie and Brandon Nodier. And since Dorothy's case was looking more and more like an abduction or even homicide, the fact that there was this active lawsuit that Dorothy was embroiled in was a big red flag. So Vallelongo naturally knew he had to speak to Bonnie and Brandon. But as Vallelongo sat across from Strada at his desk and filled him in on all this, Strada's phone rang. Strada picked it up and listened to the person on the other end, and immediately there was this look of shock that came over his face. Strada thanked the caller and then hung up, and then told Vallelongo that a body had been found in the Mississippi River the day before, about 40 miles downriver from here, and they thought it could be Dorothy. Just a few hours later, Vallelongo and Strada stood with Patricia Newman inside of an exam room at the coroner's office. In front of them was a long metal table, and lying on this table was the body of the woman who had been found inside the river. Patricia had been asked to come in here and see if this was Dorothy. But as Vallelongo looked at the body, he didn't see how Patricia was going to be able to do that, because the body was already incredibly decomposed and very bloated. The medical examiner had said this woman had likely been in the water for weeks, and they hadn't done an autopsy yet, but any findings would probably just be a guess because of how badly damaged and decomposed the body was. The only thing they did know for sure was that this definitely was a homicide. The woman was found with a plastic bag tied over her head, and she was wrapped in a lot of very heavy chains, probably to weigh her down so her body would not float up and be found. And so Vallelongo looked over at Patricia, who looked visibly anxious as she stared at this body. She seemed kind of overwhelmed by the moment. She was shaking and she was just staring, sort of shocked. But eventually, after looking at the body, she spoke. And she actually said that she didn't think this was Dorothy. And for a second, Vallelongo was actually disappointed, not because he was hoping Dorothy was dead, but for the sake of the case, to figure out where she had gone. But then he remembered something. He stepped up to the body, he put on a glove, and gently examined the woman's left hand. And there, just visible on her index finger, was a tattoo of a cross. This was Dorothy. Four days later, on May 7th, Vallelongo got to his office and sat down at his desk to start the day. And he had a lot to do, because he was now in the middle of a homicide case. The medical examiner who had done the autopsy on Dorothy didn't find any water in her lungs. So as a result, they had decided the cause of death was most likely asphyxia from strangulation or suffocation, not drowning. Now, Vallelongo had known all along that it was possible somebody had abducted Dorothy from her home and killed her. But now that it was official, He was sort of reviewing the case notes from the beginning to see if anything had been overlooked, while this was still basically considered a missing persons case. And he started with the place Dorothy was last known to be, her house. Dorothy's home was incredibly neat and undisturbed, so it was possible Dorothy was lured from her home and killed somewhere else. But Vallelonga knew from talking to her neighbors and Patricia that Dorothy was, naturally pretty reclusive and did not leave her house easily. So it sort of made the most sense to him that Dorothy must have actually been killed in her home, and the reason the crime scene was so pristine was that Dorothy was overpowered really quickly. Now, originally, Vallelonga had considered Dorothy's current handyman, Kenny Pommier, to be a suspect, since he was the last one to see her alive, because he was the one who dropped her off at her home at 4 p.m., around the time she went missing. But Vallelonga had revisited Kenny and found that he had an alibi. But even if he didn't have an alibi, Vallelonga wasn't really sure what Kenny's motive would even have been. I mean, there'd been no sign of a robbery inside of her house, and on top of that, it just didn't seem like Dorothy had much money to begin with, like she wasn't wealthy. And also the way she died, strangulation or suffocation, that's so personal. And so whoever would have done that would have had to have a reason for it. But so far, Vallelonga had not spoken to anyone who really had a serious issue with Dorothy. I mean, people definitely had opinions about Dorothy, but it was almost like people said, stay away from her. She lives on haunted land and she's killed her husbands, but it just seemed like rumor mill. There didn't seem to be somebody who really had a targeted issue with her. There was that outstanding lawsuit with the Nodiers, the two people who were, battling over the rights to her property, but it wasn't clear to Vallelonga if in the middle of this lawsuit was like real hatred between the parties. He had yet to see that. And so at this point, Vallelonga felt like his biggest problem was that he really had no real evidence. There were no witnesses, and they'd searched Dorothy's house repeatedly at this point, and they hadn't found anything useful. And there were no forensics on Dorothy's body. Since her body had been in the water for so long, all the forensics had been washed away. But just then, there was a knock on the door, and an officer poked his head in and told Vallelonga that he had something that he might want to come see. And so Vallelonga got up and he walked over, and the officer said that they had just brought this guy in for writing bad checks, and it turns out his former employer was Dorothy Thompson. Vallelonga was immediately interested and asked for more information. And the officer told him that this man's name was Elkin Childress, and he had been the live-in caretaker for Dorothy for 2 months last fall. And Elkin had told the officers who had arrested him that the reason he had wanted to work there at the pet cemetery for Dorothy was to find the treasure. Apparently, along with all the other rumors about Dorothy, there was another rumor that hundreds of thousands of dollars were, buried somewhere on Dorothy's property. And Elkin had become obsessed with finding it, but he said he never did. When Vallelonga heard this, he felt his pulse pick up. He'd never heard this treasure rumor, but it wasn't any crazier than any of the other rumors he had heard about Dorothy. And if Elkin was that serious about finding, said treasure, maybe he'd gone to Dorothy and tried to force her to tell him where it was. But before he could say or do anything, the officer told Vallelonga not to get too excited, because Elkin had an alibi for the night Dorothy went missing, and it checked out. However, the officer said that Elkin had mentioned something else that could help with the investigation. According to Elkin, there was somebody in Dorothy's life who befriended her for the sole purpose of trying to inherit everything she owned. And that person was Patricia Newman. And as soon as the officer said that, Vallelonga's gears in his head began to turn, and he thought, why didn't I see this before? After all, it was Patricia who called the authorities. She's also the one who aggressively pushed this investigation in the early days, which, Vallelonga had assumed was just because she was worried about her friend. But now he was starting to wonder if maybe she was trying to make herself look innocent. It's not unusual for killers to try and insert themselves into investigations to seem cooperative or to cast suspicion on other people. Patricia had also entered Dorothy's house multiple times before Dorothy's body was found, which certainly gave her an opportunity to interact with the scene and potentially hide evidence. And so Vallelonga turned and ran to go find Strada. They needed to speak to Patricia immediately, and this time it would be as a suspect. On May 8th, so 6 days after Dorothy was found in the river, Vallelongo once again met with Dorothy's close friend, Patricia Newman. But this time, the meeting was inside of a police interrogation room. And as Vallelongo sat at the interrogation table looking at Patricia, he was watching her very carefully. She did seem somewhat annoyed that she had been called in for this, but she also seemed very nervous. In particular, she kept fidgeting with her hands. Now, Vallelongo had really considered his approach here. Since Patricia could have been lying to him this whole time, his plan was to start off pleasant and kind of lull her into a false sense of security that he believed everything she had said was true so far. And then at some point he would surprise her with a sharp left turn and see how she reacted. So he started with some background questions about Patricia's relationship with Dorothy and nodded appreciatively as Patricia explained how she and Dorothy were good friends and Patricia also took care of her. But then, kind of out of nowhere, Vallelongo asked her about Dorothy's estate and if it was valuable or not. She did say that Dorothy owned the house and the land it was on outright, so no mortgages or anything, so it had to be worth something, but she didn't know how much it was worth. Vallelongo responded to this by saying, okay, forget the financial worth of the property. Is the property worth something to you, Patricia? At that point, Vallelongo could clearly see, Patricia realizing what was happening here. She had this alarmed look on her face, like she was starting to see that she was not being treated like a witness, but rather a suspect. And so Patricia quickly said, no, the property was not worth anything to her. She didn't want it, not at all. But she kind of turned it around on Vallelongo and said, look, if you're looking for someone who does want that property, well, you ought to speak to the Nodiers. Now, Vallelongo knew who she was referencing. These were the folks who were embroiled in that lawsuit with Dorothy before she went missing and was found dead. But Vallelongo didn't say anything. He just sort of gave Patricia a look like, oh, explain what you mean. And so Patricia took the cue and told him that the Nodiers had been Dorothy's live-in employees for years, and they were complete monsters. She said that Brandon had been verbally abusive towards Dorothy while he worked for her, and also he was one of the main people spreading all these rumors about Dorothy in town, about how he thought she killed her husbands and how her land was haunted and she was crazy. But she said that wasn't even the worst of it. She said Brandon was also a thief. She said the year before, when Dorothy was on a lot of medication for depression, like more than normal, and she was not of sound mind as a result of it, she said that Brandon and his wife Bonnie had convinced her to sign over her property to them for basically nothing. And that's when it hit Vallelongo. Like, he was aware that there had been this lawsuit over the land, but he didn't really have all the details about it. He just knew there was some dispute. And he also knew that Dorothy's lawyer had mentioned the Nodiers days ago, but that was also right before Dorothy's body had turned up and things had been sort of hectic. And so Vallelongo had not followed up with her lawyers yet. And so he didn't really have the context of, how nasty this legal fight really was. Patricia said she had convinced Dorothy to get a lawyer and to fight this, that it was not right they were doing this to her. And Dorothy had done that. She'd gotten a lawyer, and in fact, her and the Nodiers' court date had happened just 10 days before Dorothy went missing. As Vallelongo was listening, it was like he couldn't believe it. This was so obvious, and it was right in front of him the whole time. The Nodiers would clearly benefit from Dorothy's disappearance, and pretty clearly, there was real beef between the parties. So at this point, Vallelongo kind of shifted tactics and was less interested in looking at Patricia as a suspect, and instead assured her that, he would speak to them. Now, Vallelongo did speak to Patricia for a bit longer. I mean, she was still a suspect. She was very close to Dorothy, who was this older woman with no obvious heirs. And Vallelongo had not seen Dorothy's will yet, but, he wouldn't be that surprised if Patricia was in there. And if she was, that would prove she would have also benefited from Dorothy's demise, just like the Nodiers would. But regardless, Vallelongo knew he was well overdue for a conversation with the Nodiers. So they were going to be his next call. 3 days later, in the afternoon on May 10th, Vallelongo found himself back in the precinct's interrogation room, but this time it was a bit more crowded. He'd managed to track down 31-year-old Brandon Nodier for an interview, and while Brandon had agreed to talk to Vallelongo, he had also insisted on having his lawyer present as well, which immediately signaled to Vallelongo that Brandon likely had something to hide here. Vallelongo had looked into Brandon's background since speaking to Patricia, and he found out that Brandon had a criminal record, which included assault. Vallelongo also spoke to a few people in town about Brandon, and he had been told that Brandon apparently had a very hard time keeping his mouth shut. He apparently consistently seemed to threaten or go off on people whenever he got even marginally upset. He was a hothead and a loudmouth. So, given all this, Vallelongo expected Brandon to be at least somewhat antagonistic or defensive in this interview. But when Vallelongo asked him about this, highly contentious lawsuit with Dorothy, Brandon didn't seem like an angry loudmouth at all. Instead, he just seemed confused. He explained the whole thing really was just a big misunderstanding. Brandon said he and his wife had known Dorothy for 6 years and actually lived with her for part of the time. And from his point of view, he thought, Dorothy viewed them as sort of like family. And that's also why he said he believed she was selling them her land at such a low rate. It was like a family discount. He said it just sort of seemed like she really wanted them to have her property. And it was actually Brandon and his wife that had sort of insisted on paying for it. Brandon said, everything about this transaction had really been fine and above board until Patricia Newman got involved. Brandon seemed very frustrated as he began to explain how he didn't really know what had happened, but Patricia somehow got into Dorothy's head and convinced her that he and his wife Bonnie had somehow taken advantage of Dorothy. And Brandon saying that didn't happen. That's not how this went. Brandon said, as far as he was concerned, it actually seemed like Patricia was the one who was taking advantage of Dorothy. And then he said there were actually all these times when apparently Patricia was staying with Dorothy, and at some point they would get into some kind of fight, and Patricia would get mad at Dorothy, and Dorothy would flee her own house and run to the Nodier's house, for protection, for safe haven. They said that was fairly common. Patricia was this awful person that, Dorothy had to flee from. As Vallelongo heard this, he kind of didn't know what to think. I mean, Brandon could be lying to him, but truthfully, Brandon seemed very convincing. And also, Brandon just didn't really seem smart enough to be a master manipulator here. In fact, if anything, Brandon seemed kind of dense, and it was hard to believe he could engineer this murder without leaving behind any evidence or witnesses, and then also concoct this sort of brilliant story about how Patricia really was the one behind this whole thing. But Brandon's wife, Bonnie, was a suspect too, and it was possible that, she was the ringleader, and Brandon had just sort of followed along. They were divorced now, but if they were wrapped up in this lawsuit with Dorothy together, it was possible they could have, come together and joined forces to take care of the problem, i.e., get rid of Dorothy. All that's to say, Vallelongo was not going to eliminate Brandon as a suspect just yet, but he needed more evidence before he could connect him to the crime. So ultimately, he told Brandon he could leave and that he would be in touch. And then Vallelongo watched as Brandon and his lawyer stood up and filed out of the room. It was sort of funny in a dark way that just a few days ago, Vallelongo couldn't see any reason why anybody would want to kill Dorothy. And now it was like everybody in Dorothy's life, Elkin, Patricia, and now the Nodiers, wanted Dorothy's money and so really would benefit if she went away. And so now he just had to figure out who wanted Dorothy gone the most. About 5 months later, in October of 1985, Vallelongo stood in the middle of Dorothy's pet cemetery along with Sergeant Strada in total disbelief. Because all around them, almost every single tombstone had been completely smashed. Now, Vallelongo had no idea who had done this, but it was sort of oddly fitting, because just like this cemetery, Vallelongo's homicide case was a complete and total mess. Since May, Vallelongo and some other investigators had questioned both Patricia and Brandon Nodier multiple times, but all they ever did was point the finger at the other one. And now, the two primary suspects in Dorothy's murder were essentially at war over her property. After Dorothy's will was read, it would turn out that Patricia Newman had inherited a huge chunk of her estate, including whatever proceeds came from the cemetery business. But the Nodiers were saying that no, you cannot just give that to Patricia because the property is theirs and so the business is theirs because Dorothy had signed it all over to them. And the lawsuit to overturn that sale Despite it being very contentious, it had not been resolved yet, so you can't just shuffle it over to Patricia. And on top of that, Bonnie Nodier, Brandon's ex-wife, had literally moved into Dorothy's house, making it even more complicated. And so that was why the St. Bernard Sheriff's Department and the state police were at the pet cemetery right now. Patricia was there and trying to get access to the house since she needed to get some of Dorothy's things, and Bonnie wouldn't let her in. Now, the uniformed officers had just gone there to make sure everybody played nice. But Vallelongo and Strada had tagged along specifically to try to ask Bonnie a few questions. Now, Bonnie was still very much a suspect in Dorothy's murder, but so far, investigators had actually not been able to interview her. And Vallelongo had hoped that maybe this was their chance. However, when they arrived, Bonnie was extremely angry and she refused to speak to anyone and told all the officers and Patricia to get off her property. And even though the officers, along with Patricia, had eventually gotten inside and Patricia took what she needed, the officers had not been able to get Bonnie to say anything to them. She refused. And so now, Vallelongo and Strada walked back to their cruiser, past all these shattered tombstones, feeling very frustrated that they had multiple suspects here and no way to eliminate any of them. Brandon Nodier would directly benefit from Dorothy's death, because if she was dead, then the lawsuit he was embroiled in would get dropped and he would by default take control of Dorothy's land. He also had a criminal record and, according to Patricia, had been horrible to Dorothy when they lived together. Brandon's ex-wife, Bonnie, could have helped him do it too, since after all, she was named in that lawsuit as well. And she had taken full control of Dorothy's house after she died, so clearly she was intent on living there. But Patricia also could have been highly motivated to get Dorothy out of the picture, since she was named in the will. And she'd seemed really controlling of Dorothy and had repeatedly inserted herself into the investigation. And then there was the handyman, Elkin Childress, who had been eliminated through his alibi, but Vallelongo felt like he deserved another look. He had admitted that he was obsessed with finding treasure on Dorothy's property. And now all the gravestones were mysteriously smashed, which could indicate that maybe he had come back and this was, part of his attempt to find the treasure. Maybe they were inside the gravestones. Then again, if they're going to treat Elkin like a suspect, well, then anybody who had heard rumors about the treasure on Dorothy's land was also a suspect. And considering how the residents of St. Bernard clearly gossiped a lot about Dorothy, it seemed like that would mean basically everyone in town was a suspect. But without any forensic evidence or witnesses, Vallelongo didn't see how they would ever be able to connect anybody to this crime. Still, he and Strada got back in the cruiser and headed back to the station to keep at it. The investigative team kept working this case diligently for weeks and then months, interviewing and re-interviewing suspects and speaking to people who knew Dorothy. They even met with a psychic who claimed she knew who the killer was. And some people even called in with tips that they had seen Dorothy's ghost in the area and they would even go follow up in case maybe Dorothy was there. But none of that went anywhere. None of it amounted to any new, meaningful evidence that the police could actually use to bring somebody to court. And as time went on, Dorothy's case changed hands multiple times before finally going cold. "24 years later, on a Thursday afternoon in late September of 2009, Detective John Duran sat at his desk in the St. Bernard's police precinct doing some paperwork. And he just put his pen down and leaned back in his chair to take a break when another detective poked his head in and told Duran, hey, the caller was on the phone. And Duran knew exactly who he was talking about. A few days ago, an anonymous caller had put in a tip to say he had information about an old cold case from 1985, the murder of the lady who owned that pet cemetery. And Duran had known immediately that the caller was talking about Dorothy Thompson. Duran had actually used to cut the grass at the pet cemetery when he was 15 years old, and so he and his friends knew all about Dorothy. How she was, this eccentric recluse who potentially murdered people and who turned up dead one day. But during the first call, this tipster had gotten spooked and hung up without giving his name. And as soon as Duran picked up the phone to speak to the caller, he immediately said, whoever this is, you're not going to get in any trouble here. We just want your name and your location. I want to come talk to you and just hear what you know. You're not going to get in any trouble. Can you do that? There was a pause. And then the caller reluctantly agreed. Later that day, Duran and another detective sat in the living room of a New Orleans home, right across from a very fidgety-looking older man. The man's eyes kept darting all around the room, and periodically he kept looking over his shoulder like somebody was gonna, jump out at him. And it occurred to Duran as he was watching this guy that he didn't just seem nervous, about the information he was gonna spill to them. He actually seemed pretty genuinely terrified. But finally, the man took a steadying breath and said he knew who killed Dorothy, and he had known for years. Now, the guilt of knowing was haunting him, literally. He told the detectives that he had been seeing Dorothy's ghost, covered in chains, and asking him to come forward. Now, at this, Duran raised his eyebrows skeptically, but didn't say anything. This was a pretty crazy start to the story and pretty hard to believe. But at the same time, it didn't really matter what, prompted this guy to come forward. It mattered what he had to say. And so, with an open mind, Duran, along with his partner, just sat there and waited. And eventually, the old man, despite being very scared and timid, finally did just come out and say what he knew. Based on a decades-long investigation and multiple confessions, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Dorothy Thompson on the night of April 13th, 1985. Sometime after 9 p.m. that night, the killer was sitting behind the wheel of their truck, making their way up the long, winding driveway through the woods towards Dorothy's house. And as they drove along, the killer found themselves sort of looking out the window and taking in the sights, the tombstones, the trees, the house up ahead, the whole property, taking it all in. And as they did that, they thought to themselves that it was time to stop waiting for their fortune to arrive. They needed to take it. Because Dorothy did not deserve to have this. In fact, the killer believed Dorothy didn't deserve to live. And so the killer eventually arrived right outside of Dorothy's house, and they stopped their truck, they threw it in park, and then, calm as can be, they got out and they walked around to the back of the house. There, they knocked. And eventually, Dorothy, made her way to the door, and she looked out through the glass and she saw this person, the killer, and she looked confused. But it didn't stop her from opening the door. And as soon as she did, the killer didn't hesitate. They jumped on top of her. Dorothy tried to scream, but the killer immediately wrapped their hands tight around her throat, and she went silent. And then in silence, they strangled Dorothy until she stopped moving. Then, once Dorothy was crumpled, lifeless on the ground, the killer found some sheets and wrapped them around Dorothy's body and then dragged her outside to the waiting truck. Once they put Dorothy's body in the truck, they drove to a section of the Mississippi River not far from Dorothy's house. There, the killer got out, and they grabbed Dorothy's body, and they tied her hands and her feet together, and also, just in case, put a plastic bag tightly over her head. Then they wrapped her body in chains. And then once she was all prepped, the killer, calm as can be, lifted her body up, walked over to the Mississippi River, and threw her in. Moments later, the killer was back inside their truck, driving along, feeling better than they had in months. Because now that Dorothy was gone, all their problems were solved. It would turn out Dorothy Thompson's killer was indeed Brandon Nodier. He had not only tricked Dorothy into selling him her land at a very cheap price, but also, when she figured out he had basically conned her, she sued him at Patricia's urging. And when that happened, Brandon thought, okay, well, if I just kill Dorothy before this lawsuit gets dismissed, because they're going to figure out that this was not fair, that I did con her. If I kill her now, well, by default, the charges get dropped and the sale goes to me. The property is mine. On the night of the murder, Brandon was not alone. He actually asked another one of Dorothy's former handymen, a guy named James Tregler, to come along with him and basically just wait in the car. And so he had done that. Now, Brandon was an incredibly violent person, and he did not think twice about murdering Dorothy to make sure the lawsuit got dropped. But Brandon also had a famously big mouth, and he told his entire friend group what he had done. And so basically, all of Brandon's friends were aware of this horrible crime, and they totally believed what he said because they were fully capable of him being able to commit extreme violence. But they were scared of him. And that's why none of the friends came forward to say, what they knew. But finally, one of these friends was so haunted by their knowledge of this crime that they did eventually come forward. That was the caller who, told the detectives what happened. And in their rendition of what happened, they said Brandon didn't act alone. There was somebody else, a guy named James Tregler. And so as a result of that tip, it would take another 4 years, but they would ultimately speak to James Tregler, and he would confess to having been there on that night. And with that, they had enough evidence to finally charge Brandon for the murder. Brandon ultimately surrendered to authorities in 2012, and he would get a 10-year sentence for pleading guilty to Dorothy's murder. Brandon's ex-wife, Bonnie, was not involved. As for James Tregler, the other handyman who drove with Brandon on the night of the murder, he always maintained that he didn't know the murder was going to happen, and so he was given immunity from prosecution in exchange for his testimony. Even though the pet cemetery is still standing today, it's now abandoned and totally overgrown. However, treasure hunters continue to walk around the property, with their metal detectors, hoping that they'll be the ones to finally find the treasure that's buried there. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. One September afternoon in Taiwan, a young man boarded a public bus for what he thought would be just an ordinary ride home. But it wasn't that. This ride would turn out to be the single most terrifying experience of this guy's life. And we don't just have to take his word for it, because this young man managed to capture a photo of the thing that was terrorizing him on this bus for hours. And so no matter what you think of the story, the picture is fascinating. So make sure you stick around till the end to see that photo. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, on Garbage Collection Day, wake up really early, go to the Like Button's house, and take their full trash cans away from the curb and put them back in their yard, wait for the garbage trucks to come by, and then after they're gone, wheel the Like Button's garbage bins back out to the curb. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of September 4th, 2017, a young man named Zhu rushed through a bus station in southern Taiwan. Zhu's bus home to the capital city, Taipei, would be leaving any minute now, and because Zhu was running late, he knew the bus would be packed and he would get a terrible seat. And so Zhu just kept on running as fast as he could, and he finally saw his bus parked up against the curb on the outside of this bus station, and he ran up to it, totally winded, but glad that he hadn't missed his bus. And so the driver noticed Zhu standing there, and so he opened up the bus doors, and Zhu went on board, handed the driver his ticket, and the driver said, okay, take your seat, and Zhu turned, and he began walking down the aisle, and at first he almost didn't register the weirdness of the inside of this bus. I mean, he took this route all the time, and he was totally expecting this bus to be packed, but as he was walking down the aisle, he realized he was the only one on the bus. There was literally nobody else. It was just Zhu and the driver. And so for a second, Zhu thought maybe he had made a mistake and this was not his bus, but he checked his watch and, again, he had taken this bus many times and he knew this was it. And so he was about to turn and maybe ask the bus driver, but the bus driver shut the doors, turned on the engine, and began to pull away. And so Zhu just thought, well, I guess it's just my lucky day. I have the bus to myself. This is crazy. And so Zhu found a seat towards the front of the bus, and after sitting down and kind of getting situated, he just sat there and stared out the window as the driver, merged into traffic and eventually found their way onto the highway. And as they were just coasting along, Zhu really felt content. I mean, it really felt like he had this private ride all to himself, and this was not a short bus ride. It was like a 6-hour bus ride. And so the idea of just having peace and calm the whole time, I mean, that was so luxurious and unexpected. And so Zhu was just having a wonderful time, just kind of taking it all in, when all of a sudden he hears a woman coughing behind him. And remember, he's scanned the bus. It's empty. And so he whipped his head around, totally startled, like maybe there was somebody on the bus, but he looked behind him and there was no one. And so very quickly, Zhu began to rationalize what he had just heard. He's looking around thinking, okay, one of the windows is slightly open. Maybe the wind was coming in weird and causing a sound, or maybe it wasn't behind me. Maybe that cough came from the driver, and somehow I thought it was back here. Zhu's telling himself that wasn't really a woman coughing because there's nobody here. And so before long, Zhu convinced himself that, that was just an anomaly. It was nothing to worry about. And he was back there just relaxing and enjoying this peaceful ride. And pretty soon after that, he began to drift off to sleep. A few hours later, Zhu woke up, and he was very groggy, and he looked out the window and saw it was dark, and he checked his watch and saw they were maybe about halfway to their destination, and then he looked at his phone and saw he had a text message from the friend he had just been visiting, the friend he had been with before he left and got on this bus. And the friend was basically asking Zhu how the ride home was going, and Zhu, he wrote back and said, you won't believe this, I'm on a bus that's completely empty, like I have the bus to myself. And this friend, who was familiar with how packed this particular ride to Taipei was like, no way, that bus is never not filled with people. You gotta send me proof. And so Zhu opened the camera on his phone, he turned around, and he snapped a photo of the back of the bus. But when he looked at the photo he had taken, it was very grainy, and there wasn't any light in the bus, and there wasn't a flash on his phone. And so instead, Zhu, who happened to be a semi-professional photographer, he pulled out his really nice high-quality digital camera out of his bag, and with that camera, he turned around and took a photo. But when Zhu looked at the photo he had just taken, he thought there was something wrong with it. And so he zoomed in on the photo, and he couldn't believe what he was looking at. And so he checked all the settings of his camera and checked the lens to make sure everything was working properly, and it was. And so starting to get kind of scared, Zhu put the camera down and walked to the back of the bus and walked up and down a couple of times, looking for some explanation of what was in that photo. But there was no explanation, and so now feeling really scared, Zhu went back to his seat, grabbed his phone to text his friend to be like, look what I found, but his phone was dead. Even though his phone had full battery like a minute ago, now his phone doesn't work, and he can't turn it back on. And so Zhu's thinking, what do? Do I tell the bus driver about this photo? But he was worried if he showed the driver, it would be so startling that the driver might crash the bus. And so Zhu really felt completely alone and terrified, and he just placed his camera next to him and then just closed his eyes and began silently praying that he would get off this bus. But as he was doing that, he began to hear whispering right behind him, like numerous people whispering right behind him, and he whipped his head around, but again, there's nobody there. And so now, the fear is only getting more and more heightened inside of Zhu. He goes back to praying, and now, in addition to the whispers behind him, he starts to hear the sound of seats basically creaking as if somebody's sitting in them, kind of rocking back and forth. And now Zhu, he's too scared to turn around, and so he just keeps on praying, and the noise behind him, this cacophony of sounds, is getting louder and louder. And finally, Zhu looks up at the driver, hoping the driver can hear the stuff, to confirm that Zhu's not losing his mind here. But the driver looked like he was just paying attention to the road, completely oblivious to what was happening inside of this bus. And so Zhu is horrified, has no idea what to do. These noises are not stopping, despite the fact nobody else is on this bus. And so Zhu finally plugged his ears, just so he wouldn't hear it, and just tucked himself down in a ball and just continued to pray for the next 3 hours, all the way until the bus finally stopped. And when the bus stopped, Zhu unplugged his ears and opened his eyes, expecting to hear all these whispers and sounds, but the bus sounded totally quiet and normal. And the bus driver, was kind of going through the shutdown procedures of the bus. They were in the Taipei bus station. And so Zhu was feeling totally relieved here, and he couldn't wait to get off this bus. And so Zhu, he grabbed his camera and his things, packed them all up, and then as quick as he could, he began walking towards the front of the bus. But before Zhu got off the bus, the driver stopped him because he saw, Zhu looked horrible. He was sweating profusely. His skin was flushed. He looked like, something bad had just happened to him. And he asked Zhu, like, hey, are you okay? And Zhu was about to be like, oh, no, everything's fine, and just kind of get off the bus. But then he thought to himself, I have no explanation for what just happened, and that was horrifying. I don't know what that was. And I took this photo that I can't explain too, that seems definitely connected to all the noises I just heard. And now that the bus has stopped, there's no risk of showing the driver and risking scaring him so badly that we crash. And so Zhu thought, you know what, even if it makes me look crazy, I'm going to show the driver this photo and see what he thinks. And so Zhu was like, actually, let me show you something. So he pulls out his camera and he shows the driver the photo. And as the driver is kind of looking at the photo, not really sure what to look for, Zhu, he reaches down and he zooms in on the top half of the photo, and it expands the ceiling of the back of the bus. And you can very clearly see there is a huge human arm and hand extending off the ceiling, like it's reaching down into the bus. And so as the bus driver is studying this arm and hand, Zhu is saying, I thought for a second that could have been me, reflected off the ceiling or something, but I was holding the camera in my hand, and so wouldn't the camera be in the reflection? If that's my arm, wouldn't the camera be visible? Because it's not. And then Zhu also was like, I thought for a second maybe it was your arm, but you're driving the bus. Your hands are on the steering wheel. And so if this arm is your hand, wouldn't the steering wheel be in the reflection? Like, I don't understand how there's an arm with nothing in the hand reaching down from the ceiling. And then Zhu also told the driver that in addition to this totally terrifying photo of this ghost arm coming off the ceiling, there were all these weird whispers and sounds and noises behind him for the whole ride. Like, it was horrifying. And so after Zhu has detailed to this bus driver that basically your bus is haunted and I have photo proof, Zhu is expecting the driver to have a pretty big reaction to this. I mean, geez, this is pretty big news here. But the driver just handed the camera back to Zhu and basically turned to Zhu and said, you know what? You can't show this photo to anybody. Like, no one can know about what happens on my bus, because if they find out, it'll ruin my business. And Zhu's thinking, wait a minute, does this mean the bus is haunted? Is that what the bus driver is confirming here? He doesn't seem shocked. He seems like this is completely routine. This is what happens on his bus. And Zhu was about to protest and be like, are you kidding me? Like, why aren't you telling people about what's happening on your bus? But then Zhu was like, you know what? I don't know this guy. I don't care about this bus. You know what? I'm done with this. And so he said to the driver, don't worry, I won't tell anyone about, your haunted bus. I won't show anyone this photo. Thank you. And then Zhu got off the bus. When Zhu finally got to his house, it was around midnight and Zhu was exhausted. So he goes inside, he lays on his couch and he plugs his phone in because his phone was dead. And as soon as his phone turned on, he saw all these messages from his friend who had asked him to send proof that the bus he was on was really empty. And so Zhu wanted to tell his friend about all the crazy stuff that had happened on the bus. He wanted to send him that photo of, the ghost arm. But also Zhu had promised the bus driver not to share this information with anyone because it could destroy this guy's business. And so as he was sitting there kind of wondering how to respond, something caught Zhu's attention outside. And so he turned and looked out the window and he saw all these people walking down the road carrying red lanterns. And suddenly, everything sort of clicked for Zhu. It was September 5th, which is important because it marked the beginning of a big event in Taiwan known as the Hungry Ghost Festival, and the people Zhu saw outside walking around with red lanterns were clearly participating in this event. This festival is celebrated every year in Taiwan, and it's all about honoring the dead and feeding them with offerings. For example, people will burn fake money they call ghost money, and once it gets burned, the spirits of the dead can use that money during the ghost month. People in Taiwan believe that during this ghost month, the gates of heaven and hell open up, and spirits come out and walk the earth alongside all the living, which could be a great thing. If you have a dead loved one or friend or somebody, you can reconnect with them during this event, but it also can be a bad thing because sometimes angry spirits emerge from the gates of hell and they wreak havoc on the living. And so as soon as Zhu realized that, today was the start of this Hungry Ghost Festival, he realized why the day before when he was on that bus, he realized why it was empty. Because there's this superstition in Taiwan that September 4th, the day before this festival, is the day when all the spirits are traveling around the globe. And it's believed that that day is a very dangerous day for the living to be out and about, because you don't want to come in contact by accident with, one of the evil spirits. And so nobody travels on September 4th. But Zhu had just forgotten and just believed he had struck luck by having this empty bus. But then, as Zhu was kind of working this through in his mind, he was thinking, wait a minute, all that weird stuff on the bus, the whispers, the sounds, the ghost arm reaching out of the ceiling that he got on camera, Was that some sign that he had just come in contact with an evil spirit? Was he now in danger? Was this spirit gonna follow him around and haunt him? He didn't know, but now he's thinking, oh my goodness, I did the thing I wasn't supposed to do, and now I could be paying the consequences for it. And so Zhu suddenly was like, you know what? I don't care that I made some promise to the bus driver about not disclosing this photo or what I experienced on the bus, because now this is like a me problem. Like, I could have big issues here. And so he decided he would send this photo to his friend and tell his friend about what he experienced on the bus to see what his friend thought. And so after messaging his friend wrote back that he was horrified by that photo, seeing that arm reaching down out of the ceiling. That was horrifying. And his friend didn't know what to make of it and did agree that, given the fact that the Hungry Ghost Festival has just started and you were out there on the day before, this isn't good. You could have come in contact with an evil spirit here. But his friend also gave Zhu some advice of how to handle this. He told Zhu to take that photo and post it on Facebook. Now that sounds kind of goofy, but in Taiwan, there's this belief that if you have bad luck, the best way to deal with bad luck is to basically dilute that bad luck by sharing it with other people. It's kind of like those old email forwards that people used to pass around, like, hey, forward this email along to 5 other people or else you'll have bad luck. It was kind of like that. Like, just share it with the world and, pass on your bad luck to other people, basically. And so Zhu's friend told Zhu, look, I know this isn't really bad luck we're dealing with here, but maybe if you just share this with the world, dilute what happened to you, maybe that will reduce the power this ghost has over you. It's worth a shot. And so Zhu posted the photo to Facebook, and it pretty much immediately went viral. Millions of people saw it, and this is what Zhu wanted. He wanted, max dilution here, show it to everybody to reduce the chances that this, entity can hurt him. But after all these people saw it, lots of people were spooked, and they began messaging Zhu, not like, don't worry, it's diluted now, but instead they were like, hey man, you're in trouble. This thing's gonna come after you. You need to seek real help here. You're in danger. And so this ended up freaking out Zhu more than the photo did in some way. It just made the whole situation feel far more real. And so Zhu ended up deleting the photo on Facebook, setting his Facebook to private, and basically staying off social media. And then he just kind of hoped and prayed that if he did nothing and just stayed home and kind of minded his own business, that he'd be okay. And after a few days, when nothing did happen, ultimately he just told himself, I'm okay. There's no ghosts here. I'm fine. But exactly 1 week after Zhu had got off the bus, so September 11th, 2017, Zhu is in his house, he's laying on the couch, not really thinking about what had happened on the bus, and as he's scrolling social media, he comes across this headline about this horrible accident out on the highway not far from where he lived. And it was this one vehicle that got into this huge wreck, and 6 people were killed and 11 others were injured. I mean, it's this horrible, horrible accident. And as Zhu is reading the article and scrolling down, he comes across a photo of the driver of this vehicle who's covered head to toe in blood. He looks totally haggard. He's standing out on this dark highway. And Zhu realizes the driver of the vehicle was the bus driver from when he had that horrible experience on the bus. It's the same guy. And so Zhu's like, oh my gosh, what's going on here? He scrolls down and he realizes the vehicle that crashed was the exact same bus he had been riding in when all this stuff happened. It was the same bus driver, same bus on the exact same route that this accident happened. And so obviously this is like a horrifying coincidence. Zhu very likely was thinking, I'm so lucky this didn't happen when I was on the bus. But when you take into context what Zhu experienced on that bus just a week earlier, the photo, the sounds, all of it, this story gets even weirder. Because the official story is the driver was negligent, and that's what caused the crash. That's it. And he actually went to jail for negligence. But there's video footage taken from inside of the bus right before it crashed, and in the final 30 seconds, something strange happens. The driver does not seem distracted at all, he's just driving along, but then something catches his attention, something off to his side. And you can tell right away he notices whatever this thing is, and he's turning, he's looking at this thing, he's not really paying attention to the road, and he starts reaching down. I mean, he's interacting with something in the bus, and you can't see it on camera. And as he gets more and more into dealing with whatever's happening over here, the bus crashes. Now, the driver never gave any public testimony about what was going on right before he crashed. All we have is the fact that it crashed, and this video footage, and Zhu's experience and that photo he took. And when you put it all together, it really makes you wonder if there was any truth to there really being some evil spirit on that bus that maybe did cause this crash. Or is it just a series of unexplainable coincidences? You be the judge. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Divine intervention is when a deity, so God or a god, becomes actively involved in human affairs here on Earth. Now, of course, we don't know if divine intervention is a real thing, but today's story certainly offers compelling evidence that it might be. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please use all your life savings to build this beautiful luxury home right on the coastline to be used as an Airbnb, and then finally, after years of work, when it's all done, tell the like button that they can stay in the Airbnb for the first time, they're the first guest, all for free, go enjoy it, but don't tell them about all the human-hating, highly aggressive honey badgers you've hid under all the beds. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Late on the evening of November 15th, 1884, a 20-year-old man named John Lee helped his sister Elizabeth clear the dining room table in the English manor where they both worked. John was a butler at this manor, and his sister Elizabeth was a cook. And the manor itself had a name. It was called the Glen, and it was this gorgeous property right on the beach in the seaside community in England. Now, years ago, the Glen had been much more grand, and in fact, the King and Queen of England had at one point came to stay at the Glen. But recently, the Glen and the family who owned it had fallen on hard times. The staff was down to a skeleton crew of just John, his sister Elizabeth, and 2 elderly maids, which meant virtually all the physical labor at this property fell to John to take care of. So, on this night, John was lugging a huge pile of heavy china in his arms to bring out to the kitchen, and as he was doing this, he was trying to talk to his sister, who was also kind of helping clear the table, about an upcoming dinner party they were going to host at the Glen for some very important lawyers and politicians. But as John tried to talk to Elizabeth, Elizabeth just wasn't really reacting. She was kind of staring off into space, and she was only carrying 1 or maybe 2 plates off the dining room table, while John is carrying like 50. And so John was becoming really annoyed with his sister. I mean, she's not really helping, and she's ignoring him. And so John was about to complain to his sister about her behavior when suddenly she turned around and she apologized to him and said, "You know what? I'm sorry I'm acting this way. I just don't feel very good, and I really think I should go lie down." Now, John was about to be really annoyed at this, but then he noticed his sister had her hands kind of reflexively over her stomach. And John knew his sister was pregnant, and so suddenly he felt like, okay, the reason she's acting this way must be because of her pregnancy. And so he did not press the issue. Now, you need to understand that Elizabeth did not tell John that she was pregnant, nor did she tell anybody else in the house, because the owners of the Glen were very traditional and very religious, and they almost certainly would not approve of Elizabeth's pregnancy because she wasn't married. At the time in England, it was not okay to have babies out of wedlock. It was viewed as like this totally taboo thing that you should never do. But despite Elizabeth's best efforts to conceal her pregnancy, John and the other 2 elderly maids very quickly realized what was going on, because every morning they would see Elizabeth vomiting because of morning sickness. And so when they approached her and said, "Hey, it looks like you're pregnant, what's going on here?" Elizabeth refused to talk about it. She did not admit to being pregnant. She just kind of said, "Leave me alone." I mean, John didn't even know who the father was. Like, Elizabeth did not want to talk to anyone about her pregnancy. But despite all that, John and the other 2 maids really wanted to support Elizabeth and help her get through this pregnancy, without being found out and potentially fired because of it. So when Elizabeth said to John that she just wanted to go lie down because she was feeling sick, he didn't press the issue, and he just told her, "You know what? I'm fine. I'll finish up. You go lay down. I hope you feel better." By 11 p.m., John was nearly done with all of his chores, and he was getting ready for bed when one of the elderly maids came into the room and told John it was time for their nightly prayers. And without any hesitation, John put down the silverware that he was polishing and followed the maid into the living room where one of the owners of the Glen was waiting in her night clothes. The owner was a 68-year-old woman named Emma Case, and at night she really liked to lead a nightly prayer with her staff. It was something she really enjoyed doing. Now, John was not a very religious person, but he really cared about Emma, and so he agreed to do these nightly prayers really just to make her happy. I mean, after all, Emma had basically saved him on multiple occasions. John had begun working for Emma 6 years earlier when he was just 14 years old. And John, he was kind of like a rough kid and a troublemaker, but Emma, she just had a soft spot for him. And at some point, when John admitted to Emma that he was really interested in traveling the world someday, Emma would help him get into the British Royal Navy. And for 2 years, John very happily served in the military and did get to see the world. But at the 2-year mark, John came down with this terrible case of pneumonia, and it forced him to leave the military early. And so when John was medically discharged, he came back home, and he had no idea what he was going to do. I mean, he anticipated staying in the Navy for some time, not just 2 years. But luckily, Emma stepped in again, and she gave this glowing recommendation of John to one of her very wealthy friends, basically saying, hey, you should hire John. And this wealthy friend of Emma's agreed and hired John, and John was so happy, so relieved. I mean, Emma has totally picked him up again. But after getting hired, John would make a totally stupid mistake. He would steal this really expensive plate from this wealthy friend, and he would get caught. And this wealthy friend, they didn't just scold John and make him give the plate back. They got the police involved, and ultimately John would be sent to prison for 6 months for the theft. And when John got out again, he was certain nobody was going to hire him. I mean, he just went to jail for stealing. But that was when Emma, for a third time, stepped in and helped John again. Emma was a big believer in forgiving people and giving them additional chances when they screwed up. And so she said to John, you know what? I understand you made a mistake. Why don't you come back to the Glen and work for me? You can be our butler. John couldn't believe it. I mean, he knew he did not deserve this chance, especially from Emma, who's now been done wrong by him multiple times. But, he was so grateful, and he said to Emma, I'll take this, of course, and I will do anything you want, no matter what. I will do the best possible job. I'm not going to screw this up. And so far, that was exactly what John had done since coming back to the Glen. He did whatever Emma wanted, and that included nightly prayers. So on this night, after John walked into the dining room, he took a seat next to Emma at the table, and then after Elizabeth and the other 2 elderly maids took their seats at the table, they all held hands and they bowed their heads, and then Emma began to lead them in prayer. When the service was over, the 2 maids got up and headed to the kitchen to make a cup of hot cocoa for Emma. Emma typically stayed up really, really late, basically later than anybody else in the house, and she liked to drink hot cocoa and just sit by the fire and, read and write letters. It was just kind of her time to be alone and to be left alone. And so after the maids had gone, John stood up too, and he said goodnight to Emma and told her to enjoy the rest of her night, and then he made his way into the kitchen, and he went into the pantry, which doubled as his bedroom. And once in the pantry, he pulled out his cot, climbed under the covers, and he fell asleep. A few hours later, at about 3:30 in the morning, John suddenly woke up in the pantry to the sound of somebody screaming outside the door. And so John, he burst out of the pantry door, and right away he's looking in the kitchen, and it's just completely covered in smoke. He can barely see, but not far from him in the kitchen was his sister and also one of the maids. And they were the ones screaming. And they were actually screaming at John to wake up and go get everybody. We need to get them out of the house and get some help. And so John, his first instinct is, okay, clearly there's a fire or something, and Emma, she's upstairs, and she could be in trouble. And so John, he instinctively ran towards the stairs and began going up to the second floor to save Emma. But as he went up the stairs, the other maid was coming down the stairs looking totally frantic, and she would tell John that she was just in Emma's bedroom, and she couldn't see Emma anywhere, and her bed was totally on fire. And so she didn't know if Emma was even in there, but it didn't look good. And so John, at this point, he turned and went with that maid back to the kitchen, where they linked up with John's sister and that other maid, and the 4 of them filled up buckets of water and tried to run back up the stairs to attempt to put out the fire that was in Emma's bedroom. But by the time they got back upstairs, the fire up there had really spread, and there was like a wall of fire right in front of Emma's bedroom. So there was no way to really get through it, and their little buckets of water did nothing. And so even though they hated the idea of leaving Emma potentially behind, the 4 of them knew they couldn't do anything more. And so finally, the 4 of them turned and began running downstairs to evacuate. And as they ran through the dining room on the first floor, they would find Emma. She was laying on the ground, sprawled out, and it was obvious to all 4 of them that she was clearly dead. However, it was also obvious that the fire had not killed her. She had clearly been hacked to death. She had all these horrible wounds on her head that looked like somebody had taken an axe basically to her head, and her neck was so deeply cut, it was almost like someone tried to remove her head. John and Elizabeth and the two maids just stood there staring in shock at Emma, not even sure what to do. And then one of the maids just started screaming, and then all four of them just turned and ran out of the house. Eventually, some neighbors, some local fishermen, and members of the Coast Guard were able to put out the fire at the Glen. But this was not just a fire, this was a murder. And so when police came to investigate, suspicion immediately fell on John. This was back in the day, well before forensic science was used in investigations. And so at the time, the way police kind of figured out who done it is by intuition and gut feeling and assumptions. I mean, it was basically like pseudoscience. But at the time, that's how it was. And quickly, the police determined that whoever had killed Emma and inflicted these horrible injuries on her, they had to be really strong. And so the assumption was, John is the only man in the house, and so very likely the strongest person in the house. And so he must have been the one to do this, because it didn't look like anybody else had the strength to do this. Also, the investigators found these blood trails underneath the rubble from the fire that showed Emma had not actually been murdered where she was found on the ground in the dining room. Instead, she had actually been killed in the hallway near the stairs, which was not far from the pantry where John slept. And basically right outside of John's pantry door was a bloody hatchet and a bloody knife. And on top of all of that, investigators also determined that the fire had been set intentionally, and the person who set it had used this particular type of oil that was very flammable, and they had doused it all over the house and ignited it. And it turned out the only place where this oil was located inside of the Glen was inside of the pantry where John slept. So on the same day this whole fire breaks out and they find Emma dead, John was arrested for Emma's murder. Hey everybody, if you've not heard by now, our flagship podcast, MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, that pretty much immediately rocketed to the top of the charts when we launched in 2022, and then quickly was scooped up by Amazon by the end of the same year. Yeah, that show, our top show, is now available everywhere. It is no longer just on Amazon Music, it's on all platforms, and it's free. Which means if you've not listened to this podcast since it went exclusive with Amazon Music back in November of 2022, then that means you have about 100 news stories that are only on the podcast that are only now being made available to everybody. So go binge them. And if you signed up for Amazon Music just for this podcast, I love you. Thank you so much. But most importantly, there are still going to be perks for you if you continue to listen to the podcast on Amazon Music. Prime members will get to listen to the MrBallen podcast 30 days earlier than everybody else, and Prime members will get to listen to the podcast on Amazon Music with no ads. But again, the MrBallen podcast is now available worldwide on every podcast platform, and it's totally free. So please, if you would, go find the MrBallen podcast on your choice podcast platform, whether that's Amazon Music or Spotify or Apple or whatever. Give us a follow, listen to an episode, and then please rate the podcast and leave a review. It does an enormous amount for the growth of the show. I'd really appreciate it. All right, back to the stories. The next day, John was in his jail cell, and a guard came down the hall and rapped on the bars and told John he had a visitor. His lawyer was here to talk to him, but John was confused because he didn't have a lawyer, so he had no idea who this was. But regardless, the guard opened up the cell, and he led John down the hallway to this room, and when John walked in, he saw there was this man who was very well dressed and very handsome. He was sitting at this table, and clearly he was waiting for John. And John, at first he didn't really know who this guy was, but then it dawned on him that he knows who this guy is, and it made no sense that he was here to defend John. The man's name was Reginald Templar, and he was a very successful lawyer, highly respected in the area, and he also happened to be one of Emma's absolute closest friends. So Reginald Templar, Emma's close friend, the woman who's been murdered, is here to defend the person who's accused of killing Emma? It just didn't make any sense. But eventually, Reginald gestured for John to come in the room and sit down. And so John just kind of made his way in and he sat down. And Reginald immediately said, "John, I know you did not kill Emma. That's why I'm here." John was so relieved, and before long, he was pouring out all the information he could about everything he could recall about the night of the fire and the murder. And as he did, Reginald took all these notes, and he began creating a framework for John's defense. And so by the time John was back in his jail cell, he couldn't help but feel kind of optimistic that maybe with Reginald's help, he could actually beat this thing and prove he didn't do this. But John's relief would be short-lived. His first court appearance went extremely well. Reginald showed up in a fancy suit, and he was just completely on his game and just ripped the prosecution apart and basically said their entire case was just circumstantial, and he rattled off all these legal precedents, which John didn't really understand, but he looked up and saw the judge definitely knew these precedents and was impressed with what Reginald was doing. And then also Reginald would say that the police did a terrible job investigating. They basically didn't investigate and just jumped to conclusions that it was John. And so as Reginald is basically destroying the prosecution, Reginald looked over at the prosecutor, and he could tell the prosecutor looked really nervous. And so John was really starting to feel confident that Reginald was exactly what he needed. But on the day of the second court appearance, Reginald just didn't show up. With no explanation, he didn't contact anybody, and so John just sat there waiting to see what was going to happen. The judge delayed for as long as he could, but eventually when, Reginald still didn't show up, the judge looked to John and said, "I'm sorry, but you're going to have to defend yourself." Which, of course, John did not know how to do. I mean, he barely had even gone to school, let alone studied law. And from there, things only got worse for John. Reginald continued to miss court dates with no explanation, and then on other times he would show up to court, but instead of being this fantastic, very sharp lawyer, he kind of acted like a maniac. He would start all these unnecessary fights with the judge over totally irrelevant matters, like how to pronounce a particular word, and then when he had witnesses on the stand, his line of questioning didn't make any sense. He would ask things like, "Well, what did you have for breakfast today?" and "What's your favorite color?" And then finally, Reginald just withdrew altogether from the case, leaving John with no lawyer at all, which admittedly might have actually been an improvement for John. After Reginald withdrew, another lawyer found out about it and took pity on John and volunteered to take on the case. But it was on very short notice, and this other lawyer had good intentions, but was not nearly as skilled as Reginald was when he was kind of on his game on that first day. And so really quickly, this lawyer kind of fumbled the case, and then when it went to the jury to decide whether or not John was guilty, it took them less than an hour to come back and say, "Oh yeah, he's guilty, he killed Emma." And so John was sentenced to death by hanging. For the next 3 months, John sat in his jail cell waiting for his execution. And as he waited, he continually insisted that he really was innocent and that ultimately God would protect him. Finally, February 23rd, 1885 rolled around. This was the day of John's execution, except something very weird happened on this day. When John was led from the jail to the gallows where he was going to be executed, the hangman could not get the gallows to work. The trap door in the gallows where the condemned stands, where it's supposed to open up and they fall down and the noose breaks their neck, that trap door, it would not function whenever John was standing on it. Now, when John was moved off the trap door, it functioned perfectly fine. It was only when he was on that trap door that it would not work. And so think about this. Pretend you're John. 3 different times, the hangman led him onto that trapdoor. They put the noose around his neck, put a bag over his head, asked him for his last words, and they threw that lever, and each time John is expecting to die, and it's not working. Finally, after the 3rd failure, the hangman just called off the execution, and then actually a judge would weigh in and say, "You know what? We cannot possibly attempt for a 4th time to execute John. This constitutes cruel and unusual punishment," and so they swapped his sentence from a death sentence to 22 years in prison. And none of this would make any sense until one day, 6 years after Emma's murder, when John, by this point, was just sitting in a jail cell and everybody had forgotten about him. On that day in 1890, a group of very high society type people, politicians and lawyers and rich people, they all gathered in this misty cemetery not far from the Glen. The group was in the cemetery for the burial of a very important and well-respected man who had died after slowly going insane. And as the priest finished his final blessing, the mourners began chucking handfuls of dirt into the grave, and as they did, one of them said quietly but out loud, "Today we have buried a murderer." Here's what many people believe really happened on the night of November 15th, 1884, when Emma was killed. At the time of Emma's murder, Elizabeth's pregnancy was very scandalous, but not just for Elizabeth. It was also scandalous for the father of the baby, the father who nobody knew except for Elizabeth. And it was scandalous for this father because, like Elizabeth, he was worried what society would think if they found out he was having a baby out of wedlock, especially with Elizabeth, who basically from a societal standpoint was kind of below his station. But despite all that, the father of the baby did not attempt to distance himself from Elizabeth. Instead, on the night of the murder, the father of the baby actually decided to sneak into the glen to see Elizabeth. But Emma was still awake. She was up late, drinking her hot cocoa, writing and reading, and she heard the sound of the father coming into her home. And so she got up to go investigate, and she would eventually find the father up in the hallway right outside of Elizabeth's bedroom. And remember, Emma is very traditional, she's very conservative and religious, and she's seeing this strange man in her house clearly going into or coming out of Elizabeth's room, and she was so offended and angry, and so Emma just began screaming at this guy to get out of her house, and if he didn't, she was going to tell the whole world about this illicit relationship. And then Emma walked up and hit this guy right in the face, and at this point, the father just snapped, and he flew into this rage, and he began screaming back at Emma, and then he grabbed a hatchet that was on the wall right near the pantry, he pulled it off, and he brought it down right on top of Emma's head, and Emma crumpled to the ground. And the man, he's looking down at Emma, and he's realizing he's inflicted this horrific injury on Emma, and if she doesn't die, she's gonna tell someone, and then this father is gonna go to jail, if not worse. So, in a moment of panic, this father runs into the kitchen, gets a kitchen knife, comes back, and he finished Emma off. Once she was deceased, he dragged her back to the dining room where she normally did her reading and writing, and then he doused her and the whole house in that weird oil that he found in the pantry where John was sleeping, and after getting the whole house covered in it, he ignited it, and then he ran out of the house. But over the next 6 years, Emma's killer felt so bad about what he had done, both to Emma and then nearly killing Elizabeth and his unborn child, that he went completely insane, and this caused his physical health to totally fail, and he died. But right before he died, as he's laying in his deathbed, he began ranting and raving about all the things he regretted in his life, including murdering a woman at a big, beautiful seaside estate. Basically, he was admitting to killing Emma, and he did it in the company of all the people who would then be at his burial, and so that's why as they're throwing the dirt onto his casket, they're saying, "Today we buried a murderer." The killer's identity was none other than Reginald Templar, John's lawyer. Now, nobody knows if Reginald took John's case because he felt guilty and wanted to prevent an innocent man from going to jail, or if he just wanted to sabotage John's case to ensure he did go to jail to protect himself. We don't know. Either way, though, it was during the course of this trial that Reginald began his descent into madness, which would ultimately lead to his death. Some people believe the reason the gallows malfunctioned every time John stood on that trap door and it wouldn't open was because of divine intervention. That God or a god or some deity came to earth and literally interfered with the execution to spare John's life. And the reason people think that is because, John really was an innocent man and he did not deserve to die. John would serve all 22 years of his sentence, and then when he got out, he became famous for being the man who could not be hanged. John would eventually get married, and he would move to America, where he would live a very happy and quiet life until he died at the age of 81. Hey everybody, as mentioned earlier, right now you can listen to over 100 new stories on the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. It's available on all of them. And so right now, I'm going to play you a clip from an episode of the MrBallen podcast. It's called Rendezvous in Capistrano. Enjoy. At 10 p.m. that night, Deputy Tony Castillo of the Orange County Sheriff's Department was in his cruiser, out on his usual rounds. Deputy Castillo eased off the gas when he noticed a silver Dodge Stratus car pulled over in the breakdown lane on a rural highway outside of San Juan Capistrano. It was pitch black and there wasn't much traffic. Castillo figured there wasn't a reason for anyone to stop right there unless they were having car trouble, so he decided he would walk over and see if they needed any help. Castillo pulled his cruiser in behind the car. He could see that the car's engine was still running and the high beam lights were on, and the passenger side door was wide open. Just ahead of the car on the side of the road, Castillo saw a pole with an emergency phone box attached to it. He thought maybe the passenger in this car had jumped out of the car after it pulled over to go use that call box to call for help, because maybe their car had broken down. But then Castillo noticed a woman's bare foot sticking out of that open passenger door, and he knew right then something had to be wrong. Castillo radioed to let dispatch know what he'd found and that he was now going to go investigate. Then Castillo got out of the cruiser, put his right hand on his holster, and began walking towards the back of the Dodge. Castillo's footsteps on the gravel were the only sound. Castillo saw what looked like a smear of blood on the back passenger side door. But he went around to the driver's side, and he saw right away the front window was smashed. And Castillo saw a scene of pure horror inside the car. A man was slumped over in the driver's seat, still wearing a seatbelt, and a woman who had been in the passenger seat was sprawled across the front seat, basically on the driver, with her head on the man's lap. Both of them had been shot multiple times, and they were drenched in blood, and when Castillo checked both of them for a pulse, he found they had none. They were both dead. Castillo rushed back to his cruiser, and he radioed dispatch to tell them that he had just walked up on 2 apparent homicide victims out on Ortega Highway. Then Castillo ran the plates on the Dodge Stratus, and the vehicle came back as being registered to Ken and Carolyn Stahl. And while he couldn't know for sure quite yet, Castillo was reasonably certain that those were the 2 victims.
If you like that trailer and you want to hear the whole story, just go ahead and look up the MrBallen podcast on any podcast platform. It's free. And then once you find it on Apple, Spotify, wherever, just give the show a follow and then start your binge. Or you can listen early and ad-free on Amazon Music. But again, the MrBallen podcast is available on all podcast platforms. Go follow, go listen. So that's going to do it. If you want more strange, dark, and mysterious stories, then you need to check out all the Ballen Studios podcasts. You can find all of those podcasts simply by searching for Ballen Studios on any podcast platform. Okay, that's going to do it. Until next time, see ya. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious videos, click here.
Today's story is about a church in Memphis that begins to experience very strange phenomena. Now, at first, church administrators believe that whatever's happening here is just a series of pranks, and basically everybody writes it off. But one church staff decides to look more closely, and he discovers something much darker was going on there. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, for the next several days, sneak into the Like Button's kitchen after hours and add increasingly large portions of food that they hate to their fridge and their pantry. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. One morning in late February of 1982, a 42-year-old man named Sam Drash was standing inside of his office, which was inside of a United Methodist Church building in Memphis, Tennessee. And as he stood there, he was frustrated. His arms were crossed, and he was staring down at an empty bowl on his desk. So Sam was the headmaster of an elementary school that was inside of this church. This church building was massive. It not only had, the main chapel and this elementary school, but there were also dozens of offices. There was a full gymnasium, a full kitchen, laundry facilities. I mean, this place was massive. As for Sam, he spent the majority of his time in his office doing administrative work for the elementary school. And because he was at his computer all the time, just kind of doing this busy work, he found himself wanting to snack a lot. And so he needed like a healthy snack to binge on. And he found, mixed nuts were the thing he liked to eat the most that were, sort of healthy. And so he always had this big bowl of mixed nuts on his desk that he always kept full. But this morning, when he walked into his office, this big bowl of mixed nuts was inexplicably empty. And he knew the night before he had filled the bowl up, And he didn't come in between last night and now, so, who ate the mixed nuts? And so feeling pretty annoyed, he's like, all right, somebody must have come in here and taken them. Okay, fine. And so he left his office and headed to the kitchen to get some more snacks. When Sam went inside the kitchen, he saw the church's cook was at the counter cutting vegetables. And so Sam said hello to the cook and then walked right over to the pantry where the snacks were. He opened it up and he looked at the shelf where the mixed nuts always were, and the entire container was gone. And in addition to that, Sam's scanning the other shelves and seeing that a lot of snacks that he knew were typically in this pantry were also gone. It was like someone had raided the entire pantry. And so Sam, he turns to the cook and goes, hey, was there like an event here last night where they would have handed out a lot of snacks? Because I feel like all the snacks are gone here. And the cook, who at that point was still chopping vegetables, he stopped, put the knife down, and he turned and looked at Sam and said, I'm glad somebody else has noticed this, because for the last month, food has been going missing for no reason. I don't understand what's happening here. The cook told Sam that at first, the food that was going missing was pretty minor. It was really just snacks and just here and there, not a big deal. But he said more and more lately, it wasn't just snacks going missing. It was actually stuff from the fridge. And he told Sam that, at night, he put a padlock on the fridge specifically to keep people out of it, in particular the kids, who would come in and raid the fridge. He's like, it's locked. But, last night he said he put a ham in the fridge, this whole ham. He put it in the fridge and then he shut and locked the fridge. And then this morning when he came in, he opened the fridge up and the ham was gone. And he literally walked over to the fridge, opened it up and showed Sam the shelf where this huge ham was supposed to be, but now it was just gone. The cook told Sam that he had already spoken to church administrators about this strange issue, when he flagged this morning that this ham was now gone. And while they said they'd look into it, they admitted to the cook that they really didn't know what to think of it. It was just very confusing how this was even happening. At this point, Sam was just totally irritated because now he knew, one, he would have to go do his admin work without any snacks. But two, it was pretty clear that, some of the kids, probably from his school, had likely begun sneaking into the kitchen and taking snacks. And also very likely, they must have gotten a hold of the key to the padlock on the fridge, and now they're kind of escalating, stealing whole hams from the fridge. I mean, this whole thing was just totally annoying and really bad behavior. And so Sam figured he would likely have to deal with the kids at some point. But Sam told the cook, look, for right now, what I'll do is I'll also talk to administrators and I'll have somebody come in here and they'll replace the lock on the fridge. A few days later, on March 3rd, Sam walked into the church building and began heading down the hallway towards his office. For the past couple of nights, things have been quiet at the church. Sam had the lock replaced on the fridge, and it seemed like that had solved the issue of things going missing in the fridge. And also Sam had replaced his mixed nuts supply and nobody had taken any. So it seemed like, whatever was going on, maybe there was a prankster or something that clearly, changing the locks and maybe putting some additional pressure on the church administrators to let people know to stop doing this had its effect, because things were back to normal. But as Sam was walking down the hallway, he passed by the kitchen, which was open. And as he passed by, the cook who was in there saw Sam and said, hey, come in here. I got to show you something. And so Sam stopped. He goes into the kitchen and the cook is standing by the fridge and the fridge is open. And he can kind of see there's a look on the cook's face like, hey, you got to see this. And so Sam kind of has a sense of where this is going. He walks over to the cook and the cook points to an empty spot in the fridge. And he said, look, right there. There should have been several bottles of soda right there and they're gone. And so Sam's like, okay, that's not good. Clearly this is still happening. But the cook is like, no, this is after the locks have been changed. There's only a handful of people that have access to the keys, and it's like church administrators who definitely would not be taking this soda. So I don't understand how this is even happening. And Sam's like, yeah, you're right. That does sort of change things. How is this happening? But before Sam could ask any follow-up questions, the cook was like, this isn't all either. This is just one thing I've noticed. The other thing that's going on now, ever since we changed the locks, is someone is also beginning to mess with my personal stuff. He told Sam that every day when he was done in the kitchen, when he would leave, he would always leave his work shoes and his apron in one spot in the kitchen. He would leave them right there, he would leave, and then the next morning when he would come back, his things would be right there, he'd put them back on and he'd get to work. But ever since changing the locks, when he had come into the kitchen, his stuff would be moved. His shoes at one point were on the counter when he came in and his apron was put somewhere else. But nobody was stealing from him. It was like they were just messing with him. And the cook said to Sam, I just don't get it. Why are they doing this? This can't be satisfying. They don't even see my reaction to this stuff. What are they doing just messing with my stuff? Sam was equally baffled by this, and he just told the cook, look, I'll talk to administrators again and see if there's anything we can do, change the locks again, I don't know, but I'll see if anybody can help us here, because I really don't understand what's happening. And so Sam left the kitchen and headed down the hallway towards his office, with the intent to go in there and write up a report about what had just happened and hand it over to the administrators. But when Sam walked into his office, he noticed there was something sitting right in the middle of his desk that had not been there the night before. It looked like a paper towel. And so Sam, he walks up and he sees it is a paper towel, but there's a note scrawled on this paper towel, sort of like hectic, chaotic handwriting, like somebody was in a rush writing this note. And clearly they've left this note for him. And so he sits down at his desk and he begins to read the note, and it's totally upsetting. The note referenced the recent murder of this 15-year-old girl named Leslie Gaddis, who had been killed not far from the church in Memphis, Tennessee. This case was all over the news, and so Sam and basically everybody at the church had heard about it. And so he's seeing that the note is referencing this girl, but more than that, the note insinuated that there was something in the church's attic that would change everybody's understanding of this murder case. And so Sam's like, is this a prank? Like an awful prank? I mean, are the kids who are stealing food and messing with the cook's stuff, are they also responsible for this? Sam's thinking, this murder case was all over the news. I mean, everybody, including the kids in this church, had heard about it. I mean, this girl had been abducted from her bedroom in the middle of the night. I mean, it was horrible. And he's thinking, maybe this really is a prank. But at the same time, Sam's thinking that if this note is true, that there is some horrible thing or some clue or evidence up in the attic that might be useful to police about this case, like he had a responsibility to share it with the authorities. And so even though he knew he might be overreacting a little bit to this, he called the police and said, hey, you got to come down here and look at this. And so sure enough, later that day, police showed up to the church, they met with Sam, they read the note, and they went into the attic and they searched it extensively, but they didn't find anything connected to the Leslie Gaddis murder case. They didn't really find anything of note up there at all. They also searched the entire building, just in case, but there was nothing of note. And so the police told Sam that, look, your first instinct was probably right here, that this was likely a prank. Whoever was maybe messing with your kitchen food, and the cook very likely did this too. I don't know. But, if anything serious happens, about this case or anything else, don't hesitate to reach out, but this does not seem like a big deal. And so the police left, and Sam is just left in his office thinking, like, what do I do here? I mean, like, he didn't know who was messing with the stuff in the kitchen or the cook. He didn't know who had written this note, but it really started to seem like, somebody was up to something, or multiple people were, and he just wanted to understand why. Like, why is this happening? All right, guys, I just did something that I have literally never done before. Not on this YouTube channel, not on any of my podcasts, nowhere. Like, this is a brand new thing, new concept, okay? Now, normally when I, tell stories, it's just me alone talking to a camera or, on stage, but it's just me talking to you. That's the style. That's the MrBallen style, has been for years. But today, it's all gonna change because I interviewed a guest. That's right, we have a new concept called Storytime with MrBallen, where I sat down with the one and only Tom Segura, one of the hottest comedians in the world right now. He's got Netflix specials and shows, mega famous, super cool guy, and an amazing storyteller in his own right. And I talked to him not only about storytelling, but we swapped some stories. I actually told a story that's never been told before on any of our channels. It's really good. And it's just a fun new way of making content. So I think you're gonna love it. It's available right now. It's called Storytime with MrBallen. Let me know what you think. And if you guys enjoy it, I will interview more people and tell more stories like that. The video is live right now. Just click on the link in the description below and have a listen. Let us know what you think and tell us in the comments, because if people like this format, we'll keep doing it, okay? Thank you very much. And now back to the story. Over the next couple of weeks, food continued to go missing from the kitchen, despite locks being changed several more times. The church's cook continued to have his stuff messed with, and more notes, handwritten notes on various pieces of paper and paper towels, began popping up, not just on Sam's desk, but also on other church officials' desks. And these other church officials, when they got them, they were totally convinced that this had to be a prank. But for Sam, he just felt like, I don't know if this is a prank. It's not really funny. It isn't like the person doing it is really getting any big reaction. It's just kind of creepy and unsettling that somebody is, launching this bizarre campaign against the church. It didn't add up. But, even though this is all happening for weeks at this point, the final straw, at least in Sam's mind, happened the previous Sunday when he and his family were at church and his son was sitting in one of the front pews, and he grabbed a Bible and he opened it up, and sure enough, a note tumbled out of the Bible. It was one of those handwritten notes on a paper towel, and again, it referenced the murder of Leslie Gaddis. And Sam's looking at his young child, his young boy, reading this note, being like, what's going on here? And Sam's like, this is totally unacceptable. It's one thing to be leaving these notes for adults to find, but now children are going to be reading these notes? That's not okay. And so on March 17th, so roughly about a month and a half after all this strange stuff had begun happening in the church, Sam went to the maintenance crew of the church building and told them he wanted to set up a stakeout. Because by this point, Sam was starting to think, I don't know if just, some kid or kids from the elementary school are pranking the church. This has been going on for weeks now. It's sort of dark at this point with these notes that are being left all over the place. This doesn't really feel like just some kid. This actually feels like maybe an adult, maybe an outsider who's coming in to do this. For what reason, Sam didn't know, but he just felt like something's off here. And so his plan was basically he and the maintenance crew would stay in the church at night and literally hide and try to catch whoever this was, breaking in, doing this stuff in the act. By about 10 p.m. on March 17th, it was just Sam and the maintenance crew in their various hiding spots in the church, sort of centrally located so they could see the hallway that led to the kitchen, that led to Sam's office. They're all just kind of positioned, waiting. And so far, nothing had happened. The church was totally quiet. Everybody else had left for the night. It was just Sam and the maintenance crew. And they were just kind of twiddling their thumbs, waiting to see what would happen. And at some point, the maintenance crew, they got really bored because there really was nothing happening. Sam was super motivated, but the maintenance crew's like, I don't know, I don't really care about any of this stuff. And so one of them decided to just, stretch his legs and just walk around the church, just to do anything other than sit here with nothing happening. And so he got up and he walked down the hallway and he's kind of looking in each room and there's nothing going on. And as he was walking towards the nursery at the end of the hallway, he heard some movement coming from behind him. He turned around and he thought it was, one of the other maintenance workers or Sam, but no, he saw a light come on in the kitchen. And so thinking, oh my goodness, maybe I've caught this person in the act, he charges down the hallway, he goes into the kitchen, and he can't believe what he sees. It would turn out everybody had it wrong about what happened to 15-year-old Leslie Gaddis. She really was, several months earlier, literally taken from her bedroom in the middle of the night, taken out of her house. But she wasn't murdered. Everybody thought she had been, and the news acted like she had been, but she hadn't been. Instead, her kidnapper, 42-year-old Ernest Stubblefield, had taken her in the middle of the night and brought her to this church and had been holding her in the church's attic for the last 119 days. And during that time, Ernest had her at knife point and basically watched her near 24/7 to make sure she wouldn't escape. And the whole time he's telling her, don't worry, I'm gonna get ransom for you, and as soon as I do, you'll be allowed to leave. But Leslie began to realize that ransom was not materializing, and it didn't really seem like Ernest had much of a plan, and eventually he would just have to get rid of her. And so she knew, if she didn't save herself, she was likely going to get killed. And so in the rare moments where Leslie was not being watched by Ernest, for example, when they were down in the kitchen and getting food after hours, they critically had been listening the whole time, and they would hear when the locks had been changed on the fridge, and they would see where the keys were being hid, and they would just sneak down, get the keys, open the fridge up, and they would eat. Well, when they were doing that, Leslie made a point of not just taking a little food for she and Ernest, but she would take a ton of food, way more than two people would need, and she would tell Ernest, oh, it's just because, it's more for us. But really what she was doing was trying her best to signal to the people in the church that something weird's going on here. Huge portions of food are going missing. And then also she would, move around the cook's stuff, his shoes and his apron. And then in the very rare moments where she truly wasn't being watched, she would run off, grab a paper towel and scrawl things like, my name is Leslie, I'm in the attic, and leave them on people's desks, hoping that that would finally get somebody's attention. But unfortunately, pretty much everybody in the church thought it was a joke, except for Sam. However, when he contacted the police and told them, hey, I got this note that sort of suggests that maybe Leslie is being held in the attic,
Well, they went up there and they searched the attic, and they didn't find her because Ernest had found a special crawl space in the attic that nobody knew about. And so she was just feet away from police, but they didn't know she was up there. But luckily, Sam did not stop. He continued to question what was happening, continued to think all this stuff was super weird. And so eventually he has this stakeout, and that maintenance worker, after being so bored, was doing his loop, saw the light come on in the kitchen, goes in the kitchen, and what does he see? But Leslie Gaddis, alive in the flesh, standing right there. She saw him, Ernest is right behind her, and she just made a run for it and literally dove into the maintenance worker's hands, just praying that he would not run away because Ernest was sure to grab her and do something to her. But the maintenance worker, he grabbed Leslie, Ernest took off running, and he would eventually be caught. Ernest was convicted of kidnapping and sentenced to 20 years in prison. As for Leslie, she was hailed as a hero for saving herself, and she would go on to become a successful lawyer who would serve on the board of the Commission on Missing and Exploited Children. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. One day in January of 2018, a police officer walked through the woods near the small town of Gray, France. And as he walked, he was looking at the ground because he was following a literal trail of blood. And this trail eventually led the officer to the body of a person who clearly had been shot in the head. Now, this appeared to be a suicide, but the police officer had some questions because this was not the first body that had been found in these woods near the small town in France. Another body had been found a couple of months earlier, and it was starting to seem like there was a pattern here. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time you make coffee for the like button, don't use a coffee filter so there's just a ton of grinds in their drink. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. At around 5 p.m. on the evening of October 27, 2017, a 29-year-old woman named Alexia Duval drove her car down a cul-de-sac in the small, quiet town of Gray, France. She was on her way to her parents' house to celebrate her nephew's 2nd birthday, and it was going to be this big family get-together. Her sister, her brother-in-law, and her little nephew had come in all the way from Paris, which was about a 4-hour drive away. But Alexia realistically had mixed feelings about seeing them all tonight. So Alexia had been going through a pretty hard time recently. She and her husband of 13 years, Jonathan, had been trying to get pregnant, and so she'd done several rounds of fertility treatments, which had thrown her hormones completely out of whack and seemed to affect her a lot more than was typical for most women. And then finally, when all that had led to her actually getting pregnant, she unfortunately had miscarried just a couple of months ago. And so even though Alexia loved her sister's family and got along with them really well, her miscarriage was still really fresh in her mind, and she just knew it was going to be very difficult for her to be around her young nephew. It was just a reminder of what she had lost. Now, Alexia came to a stop outside of a gated driveway at the end of the cul-de-sac, and she rang the intercom. And then when the gate opened up, she drove up the driveway toward a nice house with a very well-kept garden. She parked her car in the driveway behind her father's white van, and then got out of her car. She grabbed a wrapped present out of the back seat, along with a couple of desserts that she'd made, carried them up to the house, and rang the doorbell. And a few seconds later, her mother, Isabelle Fouillot, answered the door with a big smile and led her into the dining room where Alexia's father, Jean-Pierre, sat at the table, talking with Alexia's brother-in-law, Gregory, and also her sister, Stephanie. They all stood up and they greeted her, and then as Alexia began to explain that her husband Jonathan was running late and he'd be here later in a separate car because the job he'd been working that day as an electrician had run long, as she was saying all that, Alexia heard the sound of little feet making their way towards her.
A moment later, her 2-year-old nephew, James, ran around the corner and threw his arms around Alexia's legs. And surprisingly, to Alexia's relief, she didn't feel sadness. All she felt was happiness. And so she bent down and scooped him up and gave the boy a big hug, and then she also handed him his birthday present. Eventually, the group settled in for dinner, and for a while, all of Alexia's worries just kind of faded away. She was really close with everybody at the table, especially her mother and her sister Stephanie, and being around them always put her in a good mood. Alexia's husband, Jonathan, finally arrived sometime around 8:30, and he, along with the rest of the group, had a wonderful night, eating and drinking and chatting. After dinner was cleaned up, Alexia's father did go to bed, but everybody else stayed up, and they all just continued having this nice time until around 11 p.m., when Alexia said it was really time for her and Jonathan to head home. They both had early mornings ahead of them. Jonathan had some errands to run in the morning, and Alexia was hoping to get a workout in. A few minutes later, on the drive home, Alexia sat in the passenger seat of Jonathan's car. She'd left her own car at her parents' house because she'd been drinking, and she was planning to pick it up when they came back the next day. Alexia and Jonathan's house was on a quiet residential street, only about a mile away from Alexia's parents' house. And as they made their way down the road, Alexia glanced out the window at a particular house that was just up the street from where they lived. And as she looked at it, she frowned. The neighbor who lived in that house had an adult grandson who had been harassing Alexia all summer. He'd been obsessed with her and would call and text her constantly, to the point where Alexia didn't feel safe even going out for a jog around the block when she was by herself. Now, fortunately, the harassment had stopped a couple of months ago, but only because the man had been committed to a mental hospital. But Alexia didn't really know how long it would be until he got out again, or if he'd already been released. She didn't know, so it just sort of felt like a reprieve, not a long-term solution. But on this night at least, there was nobody peering out at her from the neighbor's window. A minute later, their car pulled into their garage, and Alexia and Jonathan got out. And as Alexia went from the garage into the main house, she passed by a treadmill in the corner of the garage, which had broken down a few weeks ago. She asked Jonathan if he'd gotten around to fixing it yet, and he said no. Alexia just sighed. It was supposed to be a very cold and gloomy morning the next day, and so it looked like she was going to have to run outside. The following morning, around 11 a.m., Jonathan walked up to the door of Alexia's parents' house and rang the doorbell. And as he did, he sort of gave a worried look over his shoulder at Alexia's car, which was still parked where they'd left it the night before. Jonathan took a deep breath and tried not to show how anxious he felt as Alexia's mother, Isabel, answered the door. And then, in a very shaky voice, Jonathan said hello and asked her if she'd seen or heard from her daughter recently. And when Isabel said she had not, Jonathan completely lost his composure. He said that morning Alexia had gone out for a jog, but not come back, and now he was starting to get really worried. He explained that he'd tried texting Alexia, but she still hadn't answered, and by this point, she should have been home a long time ago, so something was wrong. A moment later, Jonathan saw Stephanie and Gregory coming out of the guest room with very concerned looks on their faces. They joined Jonathan and Isabel at the front door and asked what the commotion was about. And so Jonathan sort of frantically re-explained the situation and asked if either of them had heard from Alexia in the last hour or so. But they shook their heads and said they hadn't. But Stephanie showed Jonathan that she had received a text from Alexia at 9:30 that morning, just to say that she was going out for this jog. But after that, none of them had received any texts or calls from Alexia. Jonathan was crying at this point, and so Alexia's family tried to assure him that, Alexia would probably just show up at the house any minute here, like nothing's going on. I'm sure she's just running late. And Jonathan, he wanted to believe this, but this was completely unusual. Like, this was not normal for Alexia to be gone for this long without being in touch. It just didn't make sense. It was at this point that Jonathan's brother-in-law, Gregory, reached out and put his hand on Jonathan in a sort of comforting way and just said, look, if it makes you feel any better, I'll go back with you and we can literally go look for Alexia together, or at least be together until she comes back. Jonathan didn't really know what to do, but he was very thankful and said, yep, that would be great. And so a couple of minutes later, the two men got in Gregory's SUV and they began driving back towards their house. But Jonathan actually navigated him through the streets along the running route that Alexia usually took to see if maybe they could find her. They drove down all the side streets looking for her. And then when they reached the edge of town, Jonathan and Gregory got out of the car and began checking the paths leading into the countryside and also the ditches and the banks of the river. But they didn't find Alexia anywhere. And then eventually they just drove back to Jonathan and Alexia's house to see if maybe she'd finally come home with an explanation for all this, but she had not come home. At this point, Jonathan was completely beside himself, and so Gregory, doing his best to stay calm, said, "You know what, let's go to the hospital and see if Alexia had turned up there." A few minutes later, when they stopped in the parking lot of the local hospital, Jonathan jumped out of the car and ran towards the main entrance, where two nurses were taking a cigarette break. Jonathan told these nurses that he was here looking for his wife and that she'd gone on a run 3 hours ago and no one knew where she was now and maybe she's here. So the nurses, who could clearly tell this was an emergency, they put out their cigarettes and went inside to check the register. But a minute later, they came back and told the men that no, Alexia Duvall had not been admitted that morning. She was not here. Before Jonathan or Gregory could protest or ask more questions, the nurses just said, "Look, you gotta go to the police."
Picture this. You're doing some online shopping, and all of a sudden, you see it. That one product that you've been looking for. You add it to your cart, and as you're filling in your address, you realize you don't have your card anywhere near you. And just when you're about to give up, you see that purple pay button. One tap, and you're checked out in seconds. Shopify's Shop Pay button is used by millions of businesses all around the world, and it's why Shopify has the best converting checkout on the planet. It also helps boost conversions, meaning less carts going abandoned and more sales for you. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the entire United States, from household names like Heinz and Mattel to brands that are just getting started. See less carts go abandoned and more sales with Shopify and their Shop Pay button. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/MrBallen. Go to shopify.com/MrBallen. Again, that is shopify.com/MrBallen.
Later that afternoon, a police officer named Adeline P.O. sat across from Jonathan in a room at the Gray Police Station as he explained what had happened with his wife, that she was missing. Jonathan also gave a description of what Alexia had been wearing when she went out running. Bright pink shoes, black leggings, and a red jacket, so pretty easy to spot. And then after describing her and sort of realizing the weight of what he was here for, he just put his head in his hands and continued to weep, as he had been doing much of the morning. Now, P.O. could obviously tell that Jonathan was very upset here, but she had to ask the question that was already forming in her mind. So, as delicately as possible, she asked Jonathan if his wife had any suicidal tendencies, or any reason she might have run off without telling anybody. Jonathan looked up really quickly and just shook his head and said no, and said that overall his wife was very happy and definitely not suicidal. However, as he sat there thinking about it, he said she had been taking hormones for fertility, and realistically, those hormones appeared to have affected her really badly. For example, sometimes she would lose control of her emotions entirely and even become violent. Or in other instances, he said that she would even have memory lapses, where she wouldn't even know what she was doing when she was doing it. It was like she'd become this different person. P.O. nodded and just listened to Jonathan and wrote down everything he was saying. And then when he was done, she followed up and said, can you think of anybody who might have had a problem with Alexia? And for a moment, Jonathan just sat there in silence, kind of mulling over the question. And then suddenly his eyes went wide, like he had just realized something. He told P.O. that they had a neighbor who had been completely obsessed with Alexia earlier that year. He said his name was Arnaud, and he'd been obsessively calling and texting her so many times that Alexia had actually had to block his number, and had actually talked about how she was fearful of going out alone because of this neighbor. But just a couple of months earlier, he had been sent to a psychiatric hospital, and because he was literally removed from the neighborhood, the harassment had stopped. But Jonathan said they were kind of worried that at some point he would come back and then he would be a problem again. And realistically, Jonathan said he could be home now. I just don't know. I don't know where he is. P.O. was obviously very intrigued by this. And so after this interview was over with Jonathan, she and her investigative team began digging into this Arnaud guy to see where he was and what was going on with him. And pretty quickly, they discovered that while Arnaud had gone to that psychiatric hospital, that was true, he was not there anymore. He had been released. And so that night, another officer with the Gray Police knocked on the door of Arnaud's mother's house, where Arnaud was staying, which was about an hour away from Alexia and Jonathan's house. After the officer knocked, a middle-aged woman answered the door. And when the officer asked if she was Arnaud's mother, she said she was. The officer looked past her, and he could see there was this disheveled-looking young man sitting right inside, and he asked the mother if that was Arnaud. And again, the woman said yes. At this point, the officer asked the mother if he could come inside, because he said he needed to speak privately with her son. The mother and Arnaud in the background both seemed very confused by this, but after a minute, they both agreed, and the officer came inside. And so the officer went inside the house and sat down in the living room with Arnaud, while Arnaud's mother went to the kitchen to give the men some privacy. And then once the mother was gone, the officer looked at Arnaud and just said he had some questions about Alexia Duvall. Arnaud immediately looked down at this question, like he was embarrassed and couldn't even look at the officer. But then he looked back up again and told the officer that he had bipolar disorder, and sometimes when he was in a manic state, he acted inappropriately towards women, including Alexia. The officer followed up about all those messages that apparently Arnaud had sent to Alexia that summer, like what was going on with that. And Arnaud admitted that he had done that, but he insisted it really was no big deal. He said that he and Alexia knew each other because they had been neighbors at one point, and they'd also hung out in a group setting once, and so him being in touch with her was not totally weird, like they had a real connection. But Arnaud clarified that when Alexia told him to stop contacting her, he did. And that was the end of it. But this caught the officer's attention, because according to Alexia's husband, Jonathan, the only reason that all the calls and texts had stopped was because Alexia literally had to block Arnaud's phone number. So the officer just cut to the chase here and told Arnaud that Alexia was missing. And then before Arnaud could say anything, the officer asked him where he'd been that morning at 9 a.m. And Arnaud said, I was right here. I was at home with my mom. For a moment, the officer just stared at Arnaud, trying to read his body language to see if maybe he was being deceptive or not. So eventually, the officer just stood up and went into the kitchen where the mother was. And he asked the mother, "Where was your son this morning?" And she told the officer with sort of a bewildered look on her face that he was here with me all morning. And so at this point, it was clear to the officer that, if the mother was telling the truth here, it would officially rule out Arnaud as a suspect because, he was here. But the officer also knew that, generally speaking, mothers do not make the best alibis because mothers are known to lie, cheat, steal, and do anything to protect their kids. The following afternoon, on Sunday, October 29th, Chief Officer Frank Paredes glanced out his office window as yet another news van sped past outside down the usually quiet streets of Gray. By now, Alexia's disappearance had blown up into this huge national news story, and this was making it really difficult for Paredes, who was in charge of the investigation. Now, it was still early in the investigation, but already he and his investigators were being hounded by reporters and camera crews at every step. Paredes closed his eyes and tried to focus on what his next step should be. The search effort was well underway. They had called in reinforcements from nearby towns and even organized search teams with volunteers from the public. At that very moment, law enforcement was also using drones and dogs to scour the town and the surrounding woods. Paredes' investigation team had also searched Jonathan and Alexia's home by now, secretly hoping they might find something to pin the disappearance on Jonathan. But there was no blood, no sign of a struggle, and no clues that gave them any direction there. And also, all of Alexia's other family members, her parents, her sister Stephanie, and her brother-in-law Gregory, they could all vouch for each other's whereabouts on the morning of Alexia's disappearance. They claimed they had all been at the house together. And so without any real leads, Paredes had gotten so desperate for any information that he'd literally told his team to set up checkpoints out in the streets and just stop random people and ask them if they had seen or heard anything that could help them find Alexia. And now, as Paredes sat in his office wondering what he was going to do today, he heard a knock at his door. And a moment later, one of his investigators entered with fairly surprising news. The checkpoints actually had turned up something. Paredes listened intently as the investigator explained that a number of people he'd spoken to had mentioned a van. Now, no one had actually seen the van themselves, but they all appeared to have heard the same rumor, that apparently there was a man driving around the area in this white van, and he was known to harass girls and women right out on the street. Now, at first glance, Paredes was worried that perhaps this was just like an unfounded rumor, but then he remembered there were actually two men in Alexia's family who literally drove white vans. Her father, Jean-Pierre, he owned one, and her husband, Jonathan, he drove one for work. On the afternoon of Monday, October 30th, so a little more than 2 days after Alexia went missing, Paredes brought his car to a stop next to a news van parked in the middle of the woods about 4 miles outside of town. Minutes ago, he had received a call from an officer in the field telling him that Alexia's body had been found. And so Paredes had driven out to the scene as fast as he could. But now that Paredes was here at the crime scene, he could tell obviously he was late to the game because, a news crew was already here, setting up their cameras near a row of police barriers. And Paredes was disappointed to see this because he'd hoped that if and when her body was discovered, if she was found dead, at that time he would have had at least one suspect, or hopefully multiple suspects, identified and under surveillance before the word got out to the general public that Alexia was found dead. But now he obviously would not get that chance. Paredes sighed, climbed out of his car, and flashed his badge to an officer who led him around the barriers and into the crime scene. Paredes approached one of the forensics experts who was taking photos and placing yellow numbered markers around on the ground, and Paredes introduced himself as the lead investigator. The expert then led him over to Alexia's body, which was lying on the ground between 2 tree trunks covered by a white bedsheet. Her pink running shoes were poking out from under the sheet, and Paredes noticed that her feet and the sheet were both partially burned, as if someone had tried to set them on fire at some point. Once the scene had been fully photographed, Paredes bent down and lifted the sheet to get a better look at Alexia's body. She was lying on her back, and there were bruises all over her face, and there were also marks on her neck that looked like they were from strangulation. And right away, Paredes noticed a couple of things that were unusual. First, Alexia's hands were placed neatly in the pockets of her coat, as though her body had been placed there on the ground with a lot of care. Second, despite the beating that Alexia's face had apparently taken, her glasses were placed perfectly on her face. And so to Paredes, it seemed like whoever killed Alexia had felt some sort of remorse afterwards. It was as though the killer had committed this incredibly violent murder, but then had tried to kind of put everything back in order afterward. And this made Paredes think that Alexia's killer was very likely someone who knew Alexia, and not a stranger who simply, accosted her during a jog. Just then, Paredes heard somebody call his name, and he stood up to take a look. Nearby, there was a forensics tech that was waving him over. And so Paredes walked over, and the tech showed Paredes what he had just found. It was a gray plastic cap that looked like it belonged on some kind of spray can. Paredes thought, maybe this could help explain the strange burn marks on the bedsheet and also Alexia's shoes. The killer had probably sprayed something on the body to try and help it catch fire, but it didn't work as well as they thought it would. Just then, another forensics tech called Paredes over to them to show him something else they had found: tire tracks in the dirt. Paredes immediately thought about that tip that he had been given about this van with this person driving around town harassing women and girls, and he wondered if maybe that was true, that this van was involved and that these had been left by the killer when they were transporting Alexia's body. And so as this forensics expert began taking photographs of the tire tracks, Paredes made a mental note to examine the tires of every suspect, family member, and other persons of interest they came across, just in case one of them was a match. And so Paredes was about to turn his attention back to the body when he noticed one more unusual thing out in the woods. There was this young man who did not appear to be a reporter, just kind of wandering around out there in the trees, almost lurking near the crime scene. And so immediately Paredes went over to this guy and demanded to know what he was doing here. And at this, the man went completely wide-eyed and just started stuttering like he was totally caught off guard. Eventually, the guy managed to mumble that he was just out here picking mushrooms, but Paredes could tell he was obviously lying. That was not why he was out here. And so, operating on sort of a gut instinct, Paredes pulled out his handcuffs and placed the man under arrest. Later that same afternoon, just hours after Alexia's body had been discovered in the woods outside of town, Paredes sat down at a table at the Gray police station across from this suspicious young man he just arrested for lurking near the crime scene for no clear reason. And Paredes was pleased. He'd only been in charge of what was now a murder investigation for a couple of hours. And here he was about to speak to a legitimate suspect, really like the first suspect, who was in custody. But as soon as Paredes actually began speaking to this suspect, he realized that the young man's stutter was not really a sign of him being nervous. He actually had speech issues, and he struggled to speak at all, even when he wasn't nervous. The man was eventually able to explain that his name was Anthony and he was 29 years old. He said he lived with his parents in Apremont, another small town about 5 miles away, and he admitted that he had lied about being there to pick mushrooms. And so Paredes pressed Anthony to explain then why he was there. And Anthony, he seemed a little embarrassed as he began to explain, but what he said was he didn't know Alexia personally. He had just heard about her disappearance in the news, and he wanted to help with the search effort. But Anthony said he couldn't read or write, so he had not been able to fill out the paperwork to join the official search party. So instead, he'd just driven out to the woods in his own car to look for Alexia himself. But while he was out there, the police showed up and clearly there was something going on. And when Paredes walked over to him, Anthony said he got scared and just lied and said, "Oh, I'm out here picking mushrooms." Like he said, it was just embarrassment. And as Paredes sat there listening to the story, he wasn't quite sure what to make of it or really what to make of Anthony. Anthony's demeanor seemed almost childlike, but his behavior was not childlike. It was very adult-like and pretty suspicious. So Paredes followed up by asking him what he was doing on the morning of October 28th, which was the morning Alexia went missing. Anthony said he'd woken up at his parents' house and had breakfast with them before he went out with his girlfriend and also another friend. And he gave Paredes their names and also their phone numbers so they could confirm it. So Paredes stepped out of the room, and he did exactly that. He called the various phone numbers and spoke to the people in Anthony's life, and they all corroborated his alibi. So despite how suspicious Anthony had been acting, Paredes had no choice but to let Anthony go. A week later, on November 5th, a march was organized in Alexia's honor. 10,000 people turned out to show their support for Alexia's family and also to protest violence against women. And hidden among this huge crowd was a pair of police officers who'd been assigned to follow Alexia's husband, Jonathan Duvall. At this point, Jonathan really was looking like the most obvious suspect, since he was the husband and also the last person to see Alexia alive. So the police had tapped his phone and put him under surveillance. But all they had learned so far from the phone taps was that Jonathan made frequent calls to Alexia's family, to his own siblings and his friends, to talk about how much he missed his wife. And the officers who were literally following Jonathan around found that he really rarely left his house except to visit Alexia's parents, which he did almost every day. But so far, it was like none of Jonathan's behavior actually seemed really suspicious at all. And now, at this big march, the investigators stood in the crowd and watched as Jonathan hobbled his way up the steps to the podium, followed by Alexia's mother and father. And in fact, Jonathan was trembling so much by the time he got up there that Alexia's parents had to physically prop him up before he could begin reading his speech to the crowd. And so at this point, the investigators just kind of exchanged a glance. Either they were wasting their time following an obviously grieving husband with nothing to hide, or Jonathan was like a world-class actor giving the performance of a lifetime. But the investigators knew that until new evidence presented itself, there was really nothing they could do but, watch and wait, which included watching Jonathan and just seeing what he did. They were also still waiting on the tire analysis from the crime scene, but they didn't expect much to come from it. At this point, the creepy white van story seemed to be more like an urban legend in this town. And so, as the weeks turned to months and still there was no progress on this case, the investigators, including Paredes, began to wonder if this case would ever be solved. But then, all of a sudden, new evidence did appear. And when it did, the investigators realized they might have been following the wrong lead this whole time. Because while they'd been focused on surveilling Jonathan, a second body had just turned up in the woods outside of Gray. On the evening of Saturday, January 6th, 2018, Chief Officer Paredes was at his desk poring over the evidence that had been flooding in all day. The new victim, whose body had been found earlier that same day in the woods, very close to where Alexia's body had been found, was a 38-year-old father of 3. He looked to have died from a gunshot wound to the head, although, according to the autopsy report, the man had a blood alcohol level of almost 0.4%, which is huge. That can be fatal on its own, or at the very least, knock somebody unconscious. Investigators had found gunpowder on the man's hand, so for now, they were treating his death as a suicide. But the more Paredes looked into the evidence, the less convinced he became that he was looking at a suicide. Because, a gun had been found at the scene, but it had not been located very close to the dead man's body. In fact, the gun was found 130 feet away from the body in a trash can. The only explanation would be he shot himself and then put the gun in the trash can and then somehow wandered 130 feet away before collapsing and dying. That was possible, albeit highly unlikely. Being shot in the head typically is immediately incapacitating or lethal, but it is possible he could have shot himself and lived long enough to travel the 130 feet. It just seemed very unlikely. So now Paredes sat back in his chair and just tried to think. It was strange enough to have two violent deaths in this same quiet town, let alone to have the bodies be found basically in the exact same spot in the surrounding woods. It just seemed too coincidental not to be looked into. So he had to wonder, maybe there was a connection between this man's death and Alexia's. But later that same month, as Paredes scanned over a document that had just arrived from the crime lab, he wasn't thinking about that second body in the woods anymore. Because this new document in his hands was an expert analysis of those tire tracks that had been found in the woods near Alexia's body. And the analysis showed that there was a tiny defect in the tread of one of the tires. And this defect was so specific that the experts had been able to determine exactly which vehicle left those tracks in the woods. And this vehicle just so happened to be a white van. Paredes felt his pulse quicken as he kept on reading, and a moment later, he reached for his phone and he called his supervisor to tell him the good news. He knew the identity of Alexia's killer. Based on that tire track analysis and also other evidence, including an eventual confession from the killer, this is how police believe Alexia Duvall was killed. The killer was almost blind with rage. They slammed Alexia's head against a nearby wall and then hit her over and over again. And then they wrapped their hands around her neck and they squeezed for so long they lost track of time. They were just crushing her neck. And then finally, they couldn't feel her pulse under their fingers anymore. Then, looking down at Alexia's motionless body on the ground, they realized the severity of what they had just done. And so the killer, in a panic, crouched down next to her and actually tried to wake her up. But it was too late. She was dead. And so now they're really panicking. They thought about maybe killing themselves out of guilt, but they were too scared to go through with it. So instead, they hatched a plan to get rid of Alexia's body. The killer very carefully put Alexia's glasses back on her face, and then they lifted her up and they carried her body out to their vehicle. Then they drove out to the woods and dragged her body by the feet to a secluded spot deep in the trees where they hoped nobody would ever find her. They covered Alexia's body in a sheet, and then they sprayed the sheet with this foam that they thought was flammable, hoping that once they lit it on fire, it would help, dispose of the body. But when they got their lighter out and held the flame to the sheet, it didn't really work. And so finally, when it was clear they were not going to be able to burn the body here, the killer just left her there and then drove away in their white van, getting home in time to dispose of all the evidence, take a shower, and start the next phase of the cover-up, which was to knock on Alexia's mother's door in a fake panic, asking if anybody had seen her daughter. Because Alexia's killer was her own husband, Jonathan. It turns out, Alexia never even went for a run on the morning of October 28th. She was murdered the night before, after she and Jonathan had gotten back from her parents' house. They had gotten into a big fight, which obviously resulted in her death. From the outside, Jonathan and Alexia appeared to be a very happy couple. But in reality, they'd been arguing more and more often, primarily because they were not able to have a baby. It was causing a lot of friction in their marriage. And so on the night of October 27th, in the middle of this horrible fight they're having, Jonathan grabbed his keys and tried to leave, but Alexia told him to stop running away from their problems and tried to literally take the keys from him. And according to Jonathan, that's when he just snapped and he killed her. And then he used his work van to dispose of the body. As for that second body that was found in the woods months later, that was determined to be a suicide and completely unrelated to Alexia's death. Jonathan was arrested on January 28, 2018, and 2 days after his arrest, he confessed to the murder. At the end of his trial in 2020, he was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
10,000 feet up, deep inside of the beautiful Austrian Alps, lies a very unique and not well-known tourist destination. The only way you can get to this destination is to ride a gondola, or if you're feeling really motivated, you could, in theory, hike up to it, but very few people do that. Once you reach this tourist destination, you walk over to this string of buildings, and right away you start to see all these warning signs about this area, telling you that while of course it's stunning and beautiful, remember, it's also very dangerous. Today, I'm going to tell you a horror story that happened at this unique location. And make sure you stick around till the end, because there are actually 2 plot twists at the end of this story. The first one you might see coming, the second one you won't. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please go to the like button's big garage sale and proceed to haggle with them really aggressively over the prices of their most expensive items, to the point where they have to basically ignore their other customers just to deal with you. And then finally, when they relent and offer you a fair and decent price for these prized items, just say, nah, I'm actually not interested. I actually don't have any money. And then just leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On August 9th, 1989, 23-year-old Duncan McPherson pulled his little red car into a parking lot inside of a lush green valley in Austria. After parking his car, Duncan reached across his middle console and he grabbed an apple out of a bag, and then he took a bite and just admired the unbelievable landscape all around him. He was near the Austrian Alps, and so there were literally just mountains jutting up everywhere. Duncan, who was originally from Canada, had been this highly touted, unbelievable first-round draft pick by the New York Islanders back in 1984. The Islanders are a professional ice hockey team in the United States. But despite Duncan's incredible promise and athleticism, he just couldn't ever get it together, and so he never actually made the New York Islanders' big league roster. And so, in 1989, Duncan started to realize that maybe his hockey career was coming to an end. But instead of just hanging up his skates in frustration, Duncan decided he would pursue a different type of career that kept him still within the hockey world. He would become a coach. And so, in 1989, Duncan had agreed to coach this small-time professional hockey team in Scotland. And for Duncan, his thought was, I'll go there, I'll learn how to be a good coach, and then down the road, I'll maybe have the opportunity to coach much more prominent and prestigious teams. But before moving to Scotland and beginning this new career, Duncan decided what he really needed right now was just to take a break, because for basically his whole life, Duncan had been playing hockey around the clock, practically 7 days a week. You don't get to become a first-round draft pick unless hockey is your life. And so Duncan thought, you know what, before I begin this huge life transition, I'm gonna just kick back and relax and go on a huge European vacation. And one of the first stops of this vacation was going to be the Austrian Alps right in front of him. However, he wasn't just going to look at these incredible mountains, he was going to snowboard down them. Or more specifically, he was going to learn how to snowboard on these incredible mountains. And so Duncan finished eating his apple and then chucked the core into the bag, and then he hopped out of his car, shut the door, locked it, and then began walking across the parking lot towards the white gondola station. A gondola is like a ski lift, but much bigger. It's kind of like a small bus with lots of windows, and it's connected to a cable, and that cable, which is elevated off the ground, pulls you up and down mountains. Now, typically, people ride gondolas just for the incredible view of the mountain from up high. But some gondolas are actually in place to take people to specific locations in the mountain. And typically these locations are areas that are not accessible otherwise. You need a gondola to get there. And in Duncan's case, the gondola that he was about to hitch a ride on was of the latter variety. It carried passengers from the station near this parking lot high up into the Austrian Alps, up to about 10,000 feet of elevation, where there was another gondola station called the Eisgrot Mountain Station. And right next to the Eisgrot Mountain Gondola Station was a very unique ski resort called the Stubai Glacier. And overwhelmingly, this ski resort was the reason why people were taking this gondola. This ski resort was unique not only because it was very hard to get to, you basically had to take a gondola or hike up to it, but also because the actual slope that skiers and snowboarders would use at this resort was not just a snowy mountainside like virtually all other ski resorts around the world are. No, instead, the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort was a glacier. And so people were literally skiing and snowboarding on a glacier, hence the name. And a glacier, in simple terms, is just a huge swath of thick, permanently frozen ice. And so, in the warmer months, when other ski resorts around the world were not able to continue operations because there was no snow or it was too warm to make snow, the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort did not have that problem, because in those warmer months, they could just drive their huge snowcat tractors with their big rakes behind them all over the slope, the glacier, and their rakes would basically chop up the top layer of the ice, turning it into powder for people to ski on, which allowed them to basically stay open every day of the year. And so Duncan, back down in the parking lot, he walked over to the gondola station, he bought his gondola ticket, and then he hitched a ride on the first gondola that swung through the station. And after a slow but beautiful ride up into the mountains, where all that lush greenery down below in the valley was replaced by jagged snow and ice up in the Alps, Duncan finally saw the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort and the glacier itself right behind it that stretched up to the top of the mountain. A few minutes later, the gondola Duncan was on arrived at the Eisgrot Mountain Gondola Station, and Duncan, along with the others inside of the gondola, hopped off, and then Duncan immediately walked over to the resort and headed into the equipment rental store. And after getting a snowboard and his boots and all the other equipment he would need, he headed right back outside to wait for his instructor to arrive. Duncan had previously purchased a lesson with an instructor at the resort. It was set for 11 a.m. And so Duncan, he's out there at the foot of this glacier, and right at 11, an instructor walks over and introduces himself, and Duncan and the instructor immediately start getting into the basics of snowboarding, how to put your boots into your bindings, how to use the edges of your board. And then for a little while, the instructor and Duncan didn't go up the glacier. Instead, they just kind of worked on some basics on the flat ground right there. And then after the instructor felt like Duncan was ready to go, they both walked over to the tow rope, which is a way to get to the top of the slope. There's a cable that kind of rotates from the top to the bottom of the mountain, and there are all these bars attached to the cable, and skiers and snowboarders grab the bar while standing on their snowboard or their skis, and they literally get pulled up the mountain. And so Duncan and the instructor grabbed onto the tow rope, they made their way to the top of the glacier, and from there they pushed over to the start of the run. And once they were there, the instructor strapped into his snowboard, and then Duncan strapped into his, and then they were off, very slowly making their way, kind of like a falling leaf pattern. Duncan was not just going straight down the mountain, he's a beginner, and so it's very slow, very controlled, and as they went down, the instructor's giving Duncan tips, how to stay more on his edge, how to slow down, how to speed up, and very quickly, the instructor saw that Duncan was so good at balancing, his legs were so strong, likely because he was a professional hockey player, and so the instructor was telling Duncan the whole time they're going down how unbelievably good he was doing for his first lesson. And so finally, after about an hour of very slowly making their way all the way down this glacier, they reached the bottom where they had first been doing some flat ground stuff, and when they got there, it had started to rain, and it was raining bad enough that lots of people on the mountain were abandoning the mountain and running inside of the resort to get out from under the rain. And so the instructor, he looked at his watch and he realized they were almost at 1 p.m., which was the end of their lesson. And he said to Duncan, I don't think we have time to go back up, plus it's raining. Duncan said he didn't care about the rain, but he also understood that, it wasn't ideal conditions. And so they decided that even though there was a few minutes left, they would just cancel the lesson right there, and they would actually just go inside and grab lunch together. And so they made their way out of the rain into the resort, and when they went inside the resort, the instructor noticed that Duncan's sweater, which was underneath his yellow rain jacket, was totally soaked. And so he offered to Duncan, hey, do you want to take your sweater off and I'll hang it up inside my office, and by the end of the day it should be dry. And Duncan thought, great, that's fine. So he took off his wet sweater, he gave it to the instructor, and while the instructor was going to his office, Duncan went into the gift shop and he just bought a new sweater for the day. And after that, Duncan had his new sweater on with his rain jacket over it, and then he met the instructor in the cafeteria where they both sat down and had a nice meal. They got to know each other a little bit better. After they were done eating, both of them looked out the window and saw the rain had subsided, but in its place was lots of fog that was rolling in, and so very few people were going back onto the mountain. But the instructor told Duncan that, hey, you did so good today that you should really go back out there on your own this afternoon and practice. Do some runs, go nice and slow, same as I was teaching you, and then tomorrow, when we have our follow-up lesson, we can maybe, get into some more advanced things. Duncan thought that was a great idea. He said he would definitely go out there and practice on his own. And then the two men cleaned up, and the instructor made his way to meet his next client, and Duncan headed right outside, grabbed his snowboard, and began walking towards the tow rope. Last week, me and old Seagull Lung were wandering through Montreal when we turned onto this side street, and immediately we both stopped because right there in the middle of the road, laying unclaimed, was a fresh blue whale carcass. Now, Lung and I knew it was only a matter of time before somebody else came along, spotted this incredible treasure, and took it for themselves. And so without any hesitation, me and old Seagull Lung whipped out our portable meat smokers, and we got to work. And 99 hours later, our pockets were filled to the brim with glorious smoked street whale. However, when we tried to feed our smoked street whale to our friends and family at our annual summer barbecue, they took one bite and said, "This is kind of gross. What is this, smoked street whale?" And so, naturally, we were crushed by this, but luckily, we had a backup. HelloFresh. HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit. From chef-crafted seasonal recipes to their new Fresh and Fit summer menu, HelloFresh brings flavor right to your doorstep. And don't worry if you're a terrible cook, because HelloFresh's foolproof recipes are super easy to follow and all their ingredients come pre-portioned. And speaking of their amazing ingredients, they travel from the farm to your doorstep in less than 7 days for quality you can literally taste. So if you're worried about your Montreal smoked street whale not being a hit at your next summer barbecue, well, save yourself the embarrassment and try HelloFresh. Go to HelloFresh.com and use code MrBallen50 at checkout for 50% off plus free shipping. Again, use code MrBallen50 at checkout for 50% off plus free shipping. Okay, back to the story. The next morning, Duncan's snowboard instructor arrived a little bit early to work. And so after getting off the gondola, he made his way over to the resort and he grabbed a cup of coffee in the same cafeteria where he and Duncan had eaten the day before. And then after finishing that coffee, the instructor grabbed his snowboard and the rest of his gear and then headed outside to meet Duncan in the meeting spot they had both agreed on. But when it was time for the lesson to start, Duncan didn't show up. And so the instructor, for a second, thought, was there somewhere else we were going to meet? Did I get the time wrong? But he checked the time and he remembered the conversation he had with Duncan. They were going to meet at the foot of the tow rope and he was right there and Duncan wasn't. And so he thought, okay, maybe Duncan's running late. But he waited and waited and waited and Duncan never showed up. The instructor was bummed because he and Duncan really had kind of become friends the day before, and he was looking forward to teaching Duncan some more today, but the instructor knew it was pretty common for tourists to cancel their follow-up snowboard or ski lessons. It's like they show up for that first day, they get really into it, they plan on going the next day, but then other distractions in their vacation pull them elsewhere, and they no-show for the lesson. And so the instructor didn't take it personally. He just assumed that, Duncan had found something else to do that was more fun. But the instructor knew he would see Duncan again because Duncan's sweater was still sitting in the instructor's office. 1 week later, Duncan's parents, who were back home in Saskatoon, Canada, got a very unexpected phone call from the Dundee Tigers hockey team, which was the professional hockey team in Scotland that Duncan was going to go coach after this big European vacation. The team rep for this hockey team asked the parents if they knew where their son was because he had not shown up for his first day of work. And Duncan's parents, they immediately were like, that doesn't make any sense. He was so excited about this job. This is a really big deal for him. He would never miss the first day. And so the parents told the team rep that they would try to get in touch with Duncan, and as soon as they did, they'd be in touch with the team, and the team rep said they would do the exact same thing for the parents. However, after this call, the parents quickly realized that trying to get in touch with their son was going to be nearly impossible. They knew Duncan had gone on this big European vacation, but they didn't have his itinerary. They didn't know what countries he was going to, in what order. They really only knew that he was really excited and he was just going to be on vacation. That was kind of it. And remember, this is 1989. They can't just call Duncan. There weren't cell phones. They didn't have the easy modern ways that we all communicate instantly. And so the parents are like, who do we even call? Where do we go? What do we do? And so ultimately, even though this felt kind of dramatic at the time, the parents decided to file a missing person report with Interpol, which is an organization that connects police across international lines. However, the parents quickly learned that this missing person report was not going to become a high priority item for any police anywhere in Europe, because their son was 23, he's healthy, he's strong, he's smart, he's of sound mind, and really all that had happened was Duncan had missed a single day of work on the back end of a huge vacation. So there's lots of reasons why that could have happened. Maybe he extended his vacation. Yeah, it's not professional, but it's totally possible. Or maybe he doesn't want to take the job after all. Or maybe he's just running late. I mean, there's a lot of very logical explanations for why Duncan didn't show up. And so, in short, the parents were told that if you want to find your son right now and not just wait for him to reappear, well, you better go looking yourself. And without hesitation, that's exactly what Duncan's parents did. They packed up a couple of suitcases and they headed to Europe to go find their son. Because to them, it felt like something was wrong here and there was no time to waste. But again, the parents have no idea where their son would have gone in Europe. And so they don't really have a good starting point. They don't know who to talk to. But they just began chasing down every single seemingly insignificant lead they came across. And as they traveled all over Europe, they hung up thousands and thousands of flyers that showed their son's face, said he was missing, and here's a number to call if you know where he is. But despite these efforts, the parents really got nowhere. That is, until about a month into their search, when still they have not found Duncan, they have no idea where he is, they've chased down all these leads, they've all dead-ended. And at this time, the parents convinced several news outlets around Europe to air a segment on their news about Duncan. And one of those missing person segments aired in Austria. And the news anchor in Austria, when they were doing this segment, they described the car that Duncan was almost definitely driving when he went missing. It was that little red car. The parents had discovered in chasing down their leads that their son had borrowed the little red car from a childhood friend who used to play hockey with him, and the friend had told the parents that he had lent it to Duncan, and Duncan had told him he would have it for a week and then return it. But Duncan had never returned the car. And so the anchor in Austria does this segment about how Duncan is missing, and if you have information, come forward. They describe the little red car, and sure enough, not long after this segment aired in Austria, somebody found Duncan's car. It was still sitting in that parking lot right near the Stubai Glacier gondola. Immediately, when Duncan's parents heard about this, they flew to Austria and they met with police who brought them out to look at their son's car. They hadn't moved it. It was still just sitting where he had left it. And then also police showed the parents what they had found inside of the car, which included Duncan's passport, a letter to his girlfriend, where he talked about how excited he was to go to Scotland, and also a bag of rotten fruit. The police also told the parents that now, with the discovery of this vehicle, they were going to really lean into this missing person case to try to find their son, and that the next day they were going to launch this huge search of the area near where his car was to hopefully find Duncan. And so the parents, who were now cautiously optimistic that they might get some answers, they left the police and they went to a local hotel to rest up before the next day when they would be up early and join this huge search party. But when they got to that local hotel, they did what they always did everywhere they went in Europe. They began handing out all these missing person flyers with Duncan's face on them to everybody they saw in the lobby. They began hanging them up all over the hotel. And sure enough, just by completely random chance, they handed one of these flyers to Duncan's snowboard instructor. They handed it to him, he looked at it, and he did a double take, and he was like, I know him. And he explained how he taught Duncan how to snowboard, and then Duncan didn't show up the next day, and he just figured, okay, he blew it off to go do something else, but he'd come back for his sweater. But he never came back for his sweater, and he never heard from Duncan again. And so the parents, they have been searching all of Europe for a month, and they haven't talked to anybody who knew Duncan. They've gotten nowhere, and now they've just randomly stumbled on probably the last person to see Duncan before he went missing. And so they kept asking the instructor, give us more information. What was his attitude like? Was he stressed out? Was he scared? Was he worried about something? Where did he go? Give us anything. But the instructor really didn't have that much more information to offer. And so he tried to answer all their questions, but really just finally said, look, I'm sorry. All I know is after we ate lunch together on the 9th, Duncan said he was going to go out and do some practice runs, but I never actually saw him go up. I didn't see him come down. I just assumed he went up there and was kind of on his own for the day. And then, of course, the next day, I didn't see him and he never came back. And so I'm sorry. That's all I know. And so the parents finally said, thank you so much for the information. Please get in touch with us if you remember anything. And the instructor said he would. And then after that, the parents made their way to their room and they went to bed. The next morning, the parents got up early and they headed to that parking lot where Duncan's car was. And there were all these people, police officers and volunteers that were there to be a part of this big search party. And so after the parents explained to the leaders of the search party what the instructor had told them, that very likely their son had been up at the Stubai Glacier ski resort when he went missing, the entire search party quickly hopped on gondolas and made their way up there. And all day, this search party combed this glacier up and down. They walked all around to the backside of this mountain. They rappelled down cliffs and they hiked all over this entire segment of the mountain, but nobody found anything that gave away where Duncan had gone. And the next day, it was the same story. Huge search party looking everywhere, expanding the search, not just Stubai Glacier, but basically all over this entire swath of mountain range. But still, they found nothing. And so at the end of the second day, the authorities went up to Duncan's parents and they told them that unfortunately, we can't continue this search. We're calling it off. But Duncan's parents, they didn't call off the search. They continued searching for another 14 years. And over that time frame, they went back to Stubai Glacier over and over and over again. They searched it up and down. They knew all the staff members. They knew all the nooks and crannies of the entire place. But they never found any sign of their son. Fast forward to July of 2003, so 14 years after Duncan had gone missing. And a Stubai Glacier ski resort employee was riding the tow rope towards the top of the mountain when they noticed there was a bright yellow piece of trash right in the middle of the slope. And so the employee rode the tow rope just a little bit higher, and then he let go and skied down to this yellow thing. He reached down and he began pulling on this piece of yellow, and suddenly he stopped. And absolutely horrified, he realized this was not trash. While no one knows for sure what happened to Duncan, here is the leading theory that Duncan's family and authorities, for the most part, agree on. Back on August 9th, 1989, after having lunch with his snowboard instructor, Duncan was feeling motivated to go back out and take some practice runs. And so he headed outside, he looked up at the glacier, there's all this fog rolling in, but it's not raining, and so nobody's on the slope, and so it's perfect for a beginner. He's gonna have this place to himself. And so he grabs his board, he makes his way over to the tow rope, he straps in, he grabs onto a bar, and he makes his way to the top. Once he gets off, he makes his way over to the start of the run, he puts his other foot into his binding, he makes sure he's all set, and then he stood up and began slowly kind of waffling his way down the completely vacant and very foggy slope. And as he was going along, he got more and more confident and began going a little bit faster and a little bit faster until finally he was basically just bombing it down the mountain, relying on his natural balance and strength to kind of keep him up. And then all of a sudden, he caught an edge and flipped forward and smashed into the ground. And when he did, he broke his leg. The unique danger to humans when it comes to glaciers is something called a crevasse. Basically, cracks form in the ice, and sometimes these cracks can be massive, like mind-bogglingly massive, hundreds and hundreds of feet, that if you fall into this thing, you're done. No one's getting you out of there. You are falling either to your death, or you're falling so far down that no one can get to you. Or, like in the case of Stubai Glacier Ski Resort, they had the issue of little crevasses forming kind of all over the place. Especially if it rained, the rain would begin to crack the ice, or if maybe it was warmer than usual, the ice would crack here and there. And so the resort was really good about constantly patrolling their slope to make sure no crevasses had formed anywhere on the slope. And so when you got to Stubai Glacier Ski Resort, you were warned that there is such a thing as a crevasse. This is a real glacier, so make sure you're looking around and don't fall into one. Well, because it had rained, a crevasse had formed, a small one, like a pothole, in the slope, but because it was so foggy because of the rain, as Duncan was bombing down, he didn't see it, and that's what he caught his edge on, causing him to fall and break his leg. And so Duncan, he's now stranded in the middle of the slope. He's not close enough to the bottom to where he could pull himself into the resort. He's not close enough to the top where he could get himself up there and talk to the tow lift operator. And so he's just kind of stranded. There's nobody on the mountain. It's so foggy, nobody can see him from the resort. And so he's just stuck in agonizing pain, wondering what he's supposed to do. At the same time this was happening, another ski resort employee was climbing into one of those big snowcat tractors at the top of the glacier. These tractors were what the resort used to chop the top layer of ice and turn it into snow. And because it had rained that day, a lot of the snow had melted, and so this employee needed to basically go over the entire slope from top to bottom and grind up the ice and make some new snow. And so the employee hopped in the cab of this tractor, shut the door, turned on the engine, turned on the back rake, which in your head, picture a long stretch of metal dragging behind this tractor that had rotating blades that cut into the snow as it moved along. And so this employee, after turning on the rake and making sure everything worked, they drove the snowcat and the rake onto the start of the downward slope, and they began crisscrossing back and forth across the entire slope, turning it all into fresh snow. And as this employee drove, they were very careful not to go too quick because they knew they couldn't see very far with all of the fog. And so they're going like 1 or 2 miles an hour, being very cautious. And then suddenly, at the last second, they see something in the snow. It kind of appeared out of the fog. And so the employees swerved as fast as they could to avoid hitting it. And they did narrowly miss it. Their big tank-like treads that are on these tractors just missed running this thing over. However, the back rake with the rotating blades did not miss this object. It went right over it. The employee immediately parked the snowcat and then leapt outside and ran over to see what this thing was. And when they got there, they could not believe what they saw. It was Duncan. And all those rotating blades that had crossed over him had basically mutilated him. One of his arms had been cut off, one of his legs was nearly cut off, but it's believed Duncan was actually not dead. The injuries were horrible, but they would not necessarily have killed him outright. He would bleed to death without help, but in theory, he could have been saved. But the employee, even though this was a total accident, totally panicked and decided that because it was so foggy, no one must have seen this. No one was around, and so no one would know that they were the ones who ran this guy over. And so, instead of helping Duncan, they just tied him up and dragged him behind the snowcat off of the glacier over to this area where this employee knew there was a very deep crevasse. And they chucked Duncan, who might have been alive at this point, into the crevasse along with his arm and his severed leg, and then the employee used the snowcat tractor to rake over the crevasse. They filled it all in and packed it down, and then they drove down the rest of the way and just hoped no one would ever know. But over the course of the next 14 years, the glacier would melt more and more each year until finally Duncan's yellow jacket popped through the ice. And that's what the resort employees saw as they were going up the tow lift and thought it was trash. It was actually Duncan's jacket. They skied over, they tried to pull it out of the snow, only to then see, literally in the ice, Duncan McPherson looking right back up at them. And Duncan still looked like he was 23 years old because he had been frozen this entire time. According to the Stubai Glacier ski resort, Duncan must have just fallen into this crevasse and died. That's what they say happened, and some authorities say that is what happened. But when they pulled Duncan out of the ice and they found his body had been chopped apart and his snowboard had even been chopped apart, that told a very different story. As for the snowcat driver who drove over Duncan, they were never actually officially identified or charged with any crime because there was a statute of limitations that had run out by 2003. And so no one has ever been held accountable for Duncan's death. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's story, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, where we literally have hundreds more stories just like this one, but many of them are only available on the podcast. Again, it's called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. Today, I'm going to share 3 stories about missing people. Except the real take-home from each of these stories is not so much how or why these people went missing, but instead, it's the haunting circumstances surrounding each of their disappearances. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to fill up the like button's car with gas. But instead of actually doing that, just go ahead and permanently glue shut their gas cap. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the afternoon of April 10th, 1998, a 40-year-old woman named Diane Augutte stood at a bar inside the Hayloft Tavern in the small town of Hudson, Florida. Diane grabbed her glass off the bar and downed the last few sips of her drink, and even though by this point her vision was blurry and she actually felt sick to her stomach, she still yelled out to the bartender in a very slurred voice and told him to bring her another round. And the reason for this is because Diane actively wanted to get so drunk that she could just forget everything. Because at the moment, her life was kind of a disaster. So Diane used to be a married, stay-at-home mother with 3 kids that she loved so much, but about 10 years ago, she'd begun having some very serious mental health problems, and she'd ultimately been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. She would fall into these deep depressions that would make it almost impossible to function. And then she would swing and have these manic episodes that would literally keep her up for days on end and left her so delirious that she would start talking to herself. Eventually, Diane's husband divorced her, and he got custody of their kids. Now, Diane's life had sort of leveled off. She was living with her sister, so she had some level of support, but her bipolar disorder really was not under control. In part because she had medication for it, but didn't always take it. And so she would swing in and out of mania and deep depressions all over again. And as a result of this, she had consistently been in and out of various psychiatric facilities multiple times. So on this particular night, Diane really just wanted to drown her sorrows. And so a couple of hours earlier, she had left her sister's house and walked to this bar because she didn't have a car. And she'd been standing around at this bar, basically pacing in circles and drinking alone ever since. Just then, the bartender came over. And even though Diane was seeing double, she immediately saw that he did not have another round in his hand. He had no more alcohol. The bartender gave Diane a look that was half annoyed and half sympathetic. And he told her he was cutting her off. And Diane was so mad. She began telling him that he didn't know what he was talking about, that this was humiliating, but he just put his hands up and said, "No, I'm sorry, you're cut off." And so eventually, very angrily, Diane turned and sort of stumbled out of the bar and began walking down the street. The next day, so April 11th, Diane's mother, Mildred, paced back and forth inside of her living room, holding a phone to her ear. It rang a couple of times, and then a dispatcher from the local police department picked up. At which point, Mildred told them in a shaky voice that she needed to report her daughter, Diane, missing. So a little while earlier, Mildred's other daughter, Diane's sister, the one that Diane lived with,
had called to tell her that Diane had left the house the night before without telling her where she was going and still had not come home yet. And of course, based on Diane's history of mental illness and pretty erratic behavior, Mildred immediately felt like, oh my gosh, my daughter must be in trouble. So now, on the phone with police dispatch, Mildred explained the whole situation. She said that yes, it was possible that her daughter, Diane, had left and gone somewhere for some actual real purpose, but it was also entirely possible that she was having a manic episode and might have, in her mania, wandered off and gotten lost. The dispatcher said that she would send officers to interview Mildred and her other daughter, and they would start looking for Diane right away. But 4 days later, on April 15th, there was still no sign of Diane. That afternoon, Diane's mother, Mildred, checked in at the police station, like she had been every day since her daughter first went missing. But, just like always, the police didn't have any new information for her. So far, all they knew was on April 10th, the night Diane had left her sister's house without saying where she was going, they had figured out she had gone to the Hayloft Tavern and gotten so unbelievably drunk that the bartender had cut her off. And then at that point, she had walked out of the bar, and that was the last the bartender saw her. The following day, on April 11th, Diane had been sighted walking along Highway 19, which was just a couple of miles away from that tavern. And then she'd also been spotted near a locally owned motel right off the highway called the Coral Sands Motel. But after that, the police said they had no idea what happened to Diane, where she could have gone, or what could have happened to her. And so ultimately, Mildred left the police station feeling very disappointed and also scared. I mean, the whole drive back to her home, she felt absolutely sick with worry. She had no idea if her daughter was hiding somewhere on purpose, or if she'd gotten lost and was now injured, or maybe she was hungry, or if she'd maybe run into the wrong person and potentially been kidnapped, or worse. I mean, there's all these terrible scenarios playing out in her head. Finally, Mildred got back home and she went inside and she sat down on her couch and just tried to think about, what else she could do to find her daughter. And that's when she noticed she had a new voicemail on her answering machine. Mildred thought, maybe her other daughter had called while she was out and that was the voicemail. Or maybe it's something to do with Diane. But either way, she got up, she walked over, and she hit play. And what she heard made her feel sick to her stomach. What she heard was Diane's voice. And Diane sounded terrified. And she kept saying, "Help! Let me out!" Then there was sort of a scuffling sound on the recording, like somebody had grabbed the phone out of Diane's hand. And then Diane said something like, "Hey, give me that." And then the call just cut off. And so after hearing this, Mildred obviously went into a total panic. It's like, oh my gosh, all of the worst things that could have happened to my daughter must be happening. And so now, even though Mildred was completely upset, she's shaking with anxiety and fear, she grabbed the answering machine and looked for the caller ID to see, who left this message. But all it said was the call had come in from somewhere called Starlight, which didn't mean anything to Mildred. But she quickly, dialed this number back, hoping, whoever it was would pick up, but nobody answered. And so after that, Mildred called the police. This voicemail made it obvious to police that Diane had not left on purpose and she was not lost. It sounded like, at least based on this voicemail, that she had been kidnapped and was likely being held against her will. But as for where Diane was being held, the police had no idea. They couldn't trace the call to her specific location, and they couldn't figure out what this Starlight thing was either. So for another full day or so, the investigation, despite this new lead, basically floundered. There wasn't much to go on. That is, until the next afternoon, on April 16th, so 5 days after Diane disappeared. On that day, the police got a call from a man who said he had just been walking along the side of Highway 19 and he had found something disturbing. He said he wasn't sure if the object was even real, but he thought, for sure the police should probably come check it out just in case. And so police immediately rushed out to the scene. They found this object, they sent it off for testing, and then they waited. And when the analysis came back, they learned two things. Number one, the object was definitely real. And number two, it belonged to Diane Auget. The object was the severed tip of a finger from her right hand. Over the next few years, people kept calling in sightings of Diane Auget to the police in Florida. And the police would look into it, and they would interview more than 100 people. but nothing ever panned out. The police never figured out what Starlight was, which is where that voicemail had originated from that was left on her mother's voicemail. And the police also never determined how or why Diane's finger was cut off. But despite all that, strange clues that definitely were tied to Diane kept turning up in some very strange places. Like, for example, the manager of a convenience store near where Diane lived found a bag of Diane's neatly folded clothing inside of their store's outdoor freezer. And a customer at a different nearby convenience store found a plastic bag full of toiletries, including eyeliner and perfume and lipstick, that was left behind on a countertop. And on it was scrawled the name Diane. But police were never able to figure out who placed the bag or why. And so unfortunately, today, Diane's case remains unsolved. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Sometimes I think about being a kid, riding in the back seat at night, streetlights flashing across the window, no responsibilities, no real fear of the future. Well, if I could say something to that little kid version of me, I'd probably say, you're gonna be okay, but don't rush it. Don't wish this away. Because when things get hard, it's easy to start looking backwards. Nostalgia is basically a highlight reel. And then you look at your present and it doesn't stand a chance. Here's the thing though, the life you are living right now, you're going to feel nostalgic for this someday. And so if you spend it longing for something that's already gone, you'll miss it twice. If reaching for the past is getting in the way of living now, therapy may help you figure out what you're actually looking for. And it might also help you to start finding more of that in the present. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly, and switch anytime at no extra cost if it's not the right fit. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. Around 3:30 p.m. on December 17, 1927, a 21-year-old sailor named Joe Stevens stood inside of a U.S. Navy submarine that was cruising underwater in Cape Cod Bay, about a mile off the coast of Massachusetts. Joe was at the front of the submarine, inside of a small windowless compartment called the torpedo room. It was about 20 feet long by 10 feet wide, and on one side, there was a metal door that was open that led out to the rest of the submarine. The walls were lined with 6 bunks, a bunch of machinery, and also several torpedoes. And Joe was absolutely thrilled to be in this submarine, because Joe had always dreamed of working on a sub. When he was a kid, he'd actually made this fake periscope out of wood, which on a submarine, the periscope is like a set of binoculars, if you will, that kind of juts up above the submarine, and the submarine can rise just close to the surface, but right below, and the periscope perches kind of just barely out of the water, and it can look around to show you what else is nearby. And so with this fake periscope, Joe and his older sister Florence would spend hours and hours as kids pretending they were on a submarine deep underwater on all sorts of special missions. And so years later, when Joe turned 18, the first thing he did is he enlisted in the Navy. And recently, he had finally been assigned to actually working on this submarine. And it was really like, his childhood dream had finally come true. On this particular day, Joe was doing one of his very first test sails. Basically, he and the other 40 men on board the sub were just testing out all the different machinery on board to make sure everything was working correctly. And so Joe and 5 other men had been assigned specifically to work in the torpedo room. They stood by inside of this room and waited for a command from their captain to come through on the one-way intercom overhead. But as they're standing there, just sort of waiting around, sort of out of nowhere, Joe heard this grating, loud, metallic sound that kind of echoed through the whole submarine. In fact, the sub itself shook so hard during the sound that Joe and the others fell to the ground. And so immediately, Joe and his coworkers are scrambling to get to their feet. They're looking at each other like, what was that? But then it was like their worst nightmare began to play out, as water began to rush through that open door from the rest of the submarine into the torpedo room. And so as this absolutely horrifying scenario is playing out, Joe, his immediate reaction is actually this overwhelming sense of deja vu. Like, just for a second, he felt like, I've experienced this exact moment before. But before he could actually process this feeling, a couple of his coworkers rushed past him and managed to slam that door that connected the torpedo room to the rest of the submarine. They shut it and they sealed it. And so at this point, Joe has sort of snapped back to reality. He's not thinking about the deja vu thing. He's like, okay, like, what's going on? I mean, he realized there must have clearly been some kind of accident. I mean, basically everybody thought the same thing. That sound, the grating sound, the shaking in the water, I mean, that screams something has struck the torpedo, something's happened. He expected the captain's voice to come over the intercom, not to talk about the test run they were actually on here, but with orders about what they should do now that there was a real-world emergency playing out. And so for a couple of minutes, Joe and his fellow sailors just kind of sat there in this, sealed-off torpedo room waiting for this announcement. But there was nothing. And then Joe and the others felt a jolt as if the submarine had just settled at the bottom of the bay. At first, Joe and the 5 other sailors didn't panic. Whatever had happened, they knew clearly it was not good, but they also figured, maybe this was not a total emergency. It was bad, but maybe we can salvage this. After all, they were only about, 1 mile away from the nearest Coast Guard station. And even though Joe and the others inside the torpedo room did not have a way to actually reach out from where they were to the Coast Guard station, or anyone else for that matter, to call for help, they figured that somebody else in the other parts of the submarine would be able to punch out and call to the Coast Guard station and call for help. But the minutes turned into hours, and there was no progress. Like, there was no obvious sign that any sort of rescue was underway. They didn't hear anything over the intercom. They couldn't even hear anything on the other side of the door. They figured by now one of their comrades would have come over and knocked on the door or in some way talked to them. But no, it's just silence. And also the emergency lights inside the torpedo room eventually flickered out. They're very likely on the bottom of the bay in this sealed room in total darkness. They also had no food and no water. That was in the other part of the submarine, but they couldn't open the door without risking more water coming in. So they're just totally trapped. Now, of course, all of that was horrible. For Joe and the others, they knew how dire this situation was. But the scariest part of the whole situation was that they knew there was a finite amount of oxygen inside of this sealed room. And with every breath they took in, they were using up that air supply. And so pretty soon, this tiny metal torpedo room was starting to feel more like an underwater coffin. Joe began fading in and out of sleep. He sort of lost track of time, and he also was starting to lose hope. But then suddenly, Joe heard this loud, metallic clanging sound. And he realized someone was knocking on the outside of the submarine, like their rescue had clearly begun. And so Joe and the others immediately jumped out of their bunk, sort of knocking into each other because they can't see each other, and they went over to begin knocking back, signaling to whoever was out there that, hey, we're alive, we're still in here. By using Morse code, which is a method of communication via tapping, Joe was able to actually communicate with these folks outside the submarine. And he did confirm they were Coast Guard rescue divers, and they told Joe what happened. They explained that about 16 hours earlier, a Coast Guard ship had struck their submarine, it punctured the submarine, it sank, and everybody else, minus Joe and his people inside of the torpedo room, had all drowned. And so now the rescue divers were here to rescue Joe and the other people he was with. Now, when Joe and the others heard this news, this was horrifying, but also they're thinking, wow, had we not sealed that door as fast as we had, we would be dead. We are so lucky to be alive. And so Joe, after hearing this message, he began frantically knocking back a message, basically saying well, great, but when are you going to get us out of here? Because we're running out of air. It's getting hard to breathe in here. But the rescue divers could only tell him that they were doing their best and they would get them up as soon as possible. And this was definitely true. The Coast Guard was genuinely doing everything they could as quickly as they could to save Joe and the others. But the reality was, this was a really difficult problem to solve. You have people that are trapped inside of an air pocket deep underwater. If you open up any section of this air pocket, any section of the submarine, water will rush in so quickly that the pressure alone of that water rushing in would literally kill everybody inside. So that wasn't an option. You also have the fact that, as Joe said, they're running out of air. You have this compressed timeline to figure it out. And so really what it leaves you with is, okay, you need to basically quickly lift up the submarine, keeping everybody inside of it, and raise it to the surface. But this is in 1927. This is like a complicated thing to do with modern day technology, let alone 100 years ago. But that was sort of like their best chance, is bring in multiple ships with all these different strange lifts and somehow scoop the submarine and raise it to the surface before everybody inside suffocated. But the problem was, when they actually began organizing all these ships to try to lift up the submarine, there was this huge storm on the surface with really high winds that just battered the area, making it nearly impossible to position the different lifts off these ships. And unfortunately, this storm was going to be raging for days. And so while this catastrophe was playing off the coast of Massachusetts, about 100 miles away in Providence, Rhode Island, Joe's older sister, Florence, opened up a newspaper and read yet another article about the sunken submarine, where she knew her brother was trapped. For the last couple of days, Florence had been absolutely glued to her radio and the newspaper, desperate to hear or read some good news. But every article and every news segment, they said the same thing. The 6 men who were trapped inside the sub were definitely still alive. They were communicating with the divers, but the storm on the surface was still just too intense to rescue them. Florence felt so scared for her brother, and not just because the situation itself was objectively dangerous, but also because she remembered the submarine game that she and Joe used to play when they were little. And more specifically, she remembered the very last time they had ever played it. Joe had been about 4 years old, and the two of them had just finished another one of their make-believe missions, and they were supposed to be bringing their imaginary submarine back up to the surface. But then Joe had suddenly dropped his homemade wooden periscope, and he turned to Florence and said something so strange and so haunting for such a young child that Florence had never forgotten it. She had asked him to clarify and explain what he meant, but he had refused. And in fact, after this, he refused to play the submarine game ever again. Now, Florence hadn't thought about this in years, but now that she's seeing what's happening with her brother, it was all she could think about. A couple of days later, on December 22nd, so 5 days after the submarine had sunk, Florence received word that her brother Joe and all the other sailors in the torpedo room had died while waiting to be rescued. And Florence was totally grief-stricken. I mean, this was her baby brother who's just died in this horrible way. But also, strangely, for like the first time in her life, she felt like she actually understood what Joe had said all those years earlier when he was 4 years old, when they had played that last game of submarine. On that day, after dropping his periscope, he had turned to Florence and said, quote, "All hands were lost." This is an expression that's used in the Navy to mean everybody on board died, meaning their make-believe submarine had just sunk and everyone on board had died. And remember, after he said this, Florence tried to get, 4-year-old Joe to explain what he meant, but he wouldn't, and then he refused to play it ever again. And so now, in hindsight, Florence believed that her 4-year-old brother had predicted his own death. On the evening of April 19th, 1989, a 62-year-old man named Thomas Meehan was sitting in his living room in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, watching some TV when his phone rang. Thomas picked up and said hello, and he heard his daughter, Patricia, on the other end. And right away, he could tell by Patricia's voice that she was feeling really down, which actually didn't surprise him. So Patricia was 37 years old, and Thomas knew she'd really been struggling lately. She lived almost 2,000 miles away from Pittsburgh in Bozeman, Montana, where she worked as a ranch hand. Now, she liked her job, mostly because she loved the animals, but she just had a really hard time getting along with people, and so she was sort of lonely. She didn't really have a lot of close friends, and recently she'd been through a breakup, and even though she'd always loved kids, she'd never had any of her own. And so to Thomas, it seemed like his daughter was just going through, basically a midlife crisis. And so as Thomas is listening to his daughter, just kind of, talking about her life generally and just sort of making small talk, he sort of cut through and just said, hey, what's going on? Like, how are you doing? And Patricia, she stopped and then sort of vaguely said that she was just under a lot of stress and that she was thinking about quitting her job and moving away from Bozeman. And she actually asked her dad if he'd be okay with her coming to Pittsburgh and maybe moving back in with him. And Thomas, who adored his daughter and really felt for her, immediately was like, of course, you can come home anytime you want. This definitely lightened Patricia's mood. And then she told her dad that she'd call him back the next day to make more solid plans. And then she said she loved him and she hung up. But the next day, Thomas did not get a call from Patricia. In fact, he never got another call from his daughter again. The following day, so April 20th at about 8:15 p.m., 1,500 miles away from Thomas's house in Pittsburgh, a woman named Carol Heights was driving down a very isolated 2-lane highway in the rural town of Circle, Montana. It was dark and cold outside, and all Carol could see was the one car driving in front of her. And beyond that, it was just big empty fields on either side of the highway. But, sort of out of nowhere, this car, which had just been putting along at the same speed as Carol, it suddenly swerved off the road. For a second, Carol was just so confused, like what caused the car to suddenly veer out of the way? But then a split second later, Carol understood exactly what had happened. Because right in front of her was another car driving the wrong way, barreling down on her. And so Carol, she jammed on the brakes and she tried to swerve out of the way, same as this other car had. But she wasn't fast enough, and this other car smashed into her, basically head on. Carol felt her head snap back, there was this loud metallic crunching sound, and then blackness. But then just a couple of minutes later, Carol opened her eyes and realized she had survived the crash. I mean, she felt, pain in her neck, and her car's a mess, the airbags have deployed, like obviously she's been in a serious wreck, but she's alive. And so eventually, Carol managed to open up her door and she climbed out, with the intention of actually checking on the other driver, because the other car that smashed into her is basically butted up against her and she can't really tell the status of this person. So she gets out and she's going over to see if this person's okay. But before she reached the other car, the other driver also climbed out of their car, and in the light from both cars' headlights, Carol could see that this other person was a middle-aged woman who appeared to have shoulder-length strawberry blonde hair. And this woman, didn't appear to be hurt, at least on the surface. In fact, weirdly, she seemed very, very calm. And this woman, she just stood there by her car, not saying a word to Carol or in any way recognizing what she had just done, which is drive the wrong way and smash into Carol, could have killed Carol. No recognition of that. Instead, she just stood there, and then eventually she turned and just stared at Carol. And this was sort of alarming to Carol, and it caused her to just stop and also just stand there staring at this woman, not really sure what to do. And as Carol is waiting to see what they're going to do, the other driver, this middle-aged woman, just turned and started walking away. At this point, Carol yelled to her to stop. You can't go. We had this horrible accident. We have to wait for authorities to get here. You can't just leave. But this woman, she didn't even look back to talk to Carol. She just calmly walked off the highway and then climbed over a fence into one of those big empty fields on the side of the road and just kept on walking until Carol couldn't see her anymore. She just vanished. When the police arrived about 45 minutes later at 9 p.m., they found the wreck and they found Carol, and this other driver again was just gone. And so they ran the license plate of the other car, the one that hit Carol's, and they learned that it was registered to 37-year-old Patricia Meehan. But beyond the fact that apparently Patricia had just wandered off here, the other weird thing about this was the registration showed that Patricia lived 400 miles away. So they really weren't sure what she was even doing all the way out here. Now, Patricia did not come back to the crash site, and so eventually police got canine units out there and they began looking for her. And they were able to find a trail of her footprints out in that field. And they followed that trail for hours and hours, but eventually the footprints just stopped and the dogs lost her scent. Now, police would continue looking for Patricia for nearly a week with no luck. I mean, they never found another trace of Patricia. It really was like she wandered into that field and just sort of vanished. But that was not the end of the story. Because about 2 weeks later, a totally unrelated police officer was eating at a fast food restaurant in Laverne, Minnesota, which was about 700 miles away from the crash site. Now, even though this officer lived and worked in a completely different state, they'd actually heard about Patricia Meehan's disappearance and seen pictures of her, because her case was now national news. So when this officer looked across the restaurant he was in and saw a middle-aged woman with strawberry blonde hair sitting in a booth by herself, silently drinking water and just staring off into space, he immediately recognized her as Patricia. Now, the police officer had no idea if this really was Patricia. He was confident it was, but this just seems so random and so bizarre that she would be here, of all places. He also didn't know if this person was alone or not, or what she was even trying to do. So instead of getting up and going and talking to her, he just stayed in his seat and kept an eye on her. And for the next 5 hours, the woman he believed was Patricia just sat there in the booth, slowly drinking water, just staring off into space for 5 hours. Eventually, the restaurant closed, at which point an employee had to tell this woman to get up and go. They also told the officer that he too had to leave. And so after the officer and this woman who he thought was Patricia had left this restaurant, the officer kind of hung back and continued watching the woman, and she just went right across the street to a diner. And this time, the officer did not keep his distance. He went inside the diner, and he went right over to where she was sitting at a table, and he sat down next to her, and he just said, "What's your name?" And for a moment, the woman seemed kind of confused why, this random police officer was even sitting with her to begin with. But instead of, challenging the police officer, she just went quiet for a second, and then in a sort of hushed voice, she said that she was from Colorado. But then a moment later, she shook her head and said, "Actually, no, I'm from Israel." And then, before she gave up any more information, like her name or why she was here or anything, she jumped up out of her seat and ran outside. And the police officer was kind of caught off guard by this and was a little bit slow to get up and chase after her. But he ran outside too, and by the time he got out there, she had disappeared. Over the next month or so, the police in charge of Patricia's case received dozens of reports like this from people who believed they saw Patricia at restaurants and truck stops all over America. And the police actually confirmed many of these sightings, meaning they believed that these witnesses really did see Patricia. It was not just some lookalike. And in every case, witnesses reported that this woman, presumably Patricia, refused to speak and was just staring vacantly into space. She didn't seem to know who she was or what she was even doing. But also, in every one of these cases, before anybody could intervene or ask her questions or just help her in some way, Patricia would run off and disappear again. It was like Patricia was a ghost, appearing and disappearing over and over again all over the country. As of today, there have been over 5,000 reported sightings of Patricia Meehan. But still, we do not know where she is. Her case still today is open and unsolved. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.